So, welcome back to my channel, Fiction Star. The series name is, What If Naruto Teleported in Attack on Titan and Married with Annie Leonhardt. I hope you enjoy the first part of the series, began with next chapter, so do not wasting any more time, let's start the video. Sensei, bois. Naruto cried out in surprise as he found himself swarmed by his students, nearly bowled over. When Mina and the others rushed him, he hadn't been expecting this. Were he in his Titan form he wouldn't have budged so much as an inch. But now that he was human again it was another matter. He found himself knocked to the ground, wincing as a fresh lance of agony coursed down his spine when his back struck the stones and scraped across his skin. It hurt, but it was a good pain, the kind one felt after surviving a long, arduous mission and returning to the welcoming arms of a loved one, or loved ones, in this case, plural, as in more than one. Oh, happy day. I know what it means, Baka Kitsune. Well, excuse me for celebrating. I'm just happy that finally have so many potential successors. Can't argue with you there. And thus, for the first time in centuries, Uzumaki Naruto found himself in the awkward position of having two girls fussing over him. Before he knew it, Sasha had him by one arm and Mina the other. Krista herself was practically in tears upon seeing him alive and well. It took Emer a good 5 minutes to calm her friend down and reassure her that the blonde bastard would be going anywhere anytime soon. For a bunch of kids who hadn't expected him to come back, Naruto mused, they'd reacted most prudently. Disappearing for an hour must have had them worried sick, but it had been necessary. I'm back, he supplied with a small smile. Now nearly an hour later, here he was. He'd barely had time to make the excuse of searching for survivors before Mina and Sasha had tackled him. He could see Jean standing off to one side, carefully avoiding his gaze whenever he looked, trying and failing to hide himself behind a nearby table. Naruto was just about to ask what was bothering him when the girls began tugging on his arms again. Are you hurt anywhere, sensei? Sasha asked, her brown orbs flicking over his battered body. Are you hungry? Do you need any food? Absently, he noted the half-eaten loaf of bread in her hand. Oh, the irony. Sasha was asking him if was hungry when she herself had food? Definitely his student. Not like she'd share though. I have bandages, Mina added. Naruto turned his head to regard the blackhead. This girl who by all rights should have been dead by now. A cross-shaped scar on her temple where a titan's tooth had grazed her was the only indication that she'd nearly been devoured hours before. She had claimed her first kill minutes later. In her hand she clutched a roll of gauze, obviously not meant for her, but for him. Pity she didn't know about his regeneration. Sensei needs food first, the brunette insisted, pushing past her. Did you see how hard he was fighting down there? He's probably starving. What? Sasha, don't be silly. Mina laughed. You can feed them after I tend his wounds. He doesn't have any. And how do you know that? How would you know if he didn't? Sparks shot between their eyes. Naruto knew that look all too well. Food, bandages, food, bandages. Okay. His grunts dissolved into laughter when they wouldn't let go of his arms. Mina. Sasha. I'm fine. Really, I am. Physically, at least. As far as his attire was concerned, not so much. He'd lost his cloak and half of his shirt in his maddened scramble to get up the wall, and no amount of regeneration could return those. Come to think of it, wasn't this kind of awkward? What with two girls clinging to either arm and another crying over him, with the former stealing the occasional glance at his scarred, muscular chest. Really, it was, and yet Naruto found he didn't mind it as much as he should have now that the danger was past. It was only natural that they were concerned, that they were staring bleeding. Wait a minute? That last one didn't make one iota of sense. Ah, Mina? Your nose. Ha! It's bleeding. The blackhead blinked for a long moment, her hand slowly traveling to her face. Sure enough, it came away bloody. Her eyes grew large and wide. There was a silence, long and dreadful, as she finally realized everyone was staring at her, more pointedly, her nose. Kaya! She cried. Naruto no Eki, how am I a pervert for pointing that out? The laughter that came next felt even better than before. It was as if a weight had been taken from his shoulders. It felt good to be safe. After fighting all those titans down there, he'd been more than careful. After giving Eren to Mikasa and the others in his titan form, he'd said nothing, given no indication of who he was. It was simply too risky. There would already be an uproar once everyone learned of Aaron's secret, and he had no desire to add to that chaos. So like Annie he disappeared into the city seeking a safe place to rip himself out of the folds of his neck in relative solitude. He knew she was around somewhere. Just as he knew she wouldn't want to be disturbed, least of all by him. She just betrayed her ideals however briefly to rescue him back in the square, forfeiting the priority of her mission to save his life. Change wasn't an easy thing. It never was. It could be awful, painful, sometimes even dreadful, as he'd come to realize himself. And sometimes it could be wonderful. Annie would have to learn that on her own. Yes, he couldn't show her that. It was one of the few things she would have to learn the hard way. He'd use sage mode to determine her whereabouts before she was somewhere up here, somewhere atop these walls with their comrades, radiating sadness and sorrow, taking great pains to avoid him. No matter, he would let her come to him when the time was right. Speaking of right, oi Jean, his apprentice stiffened, suddenly aware that his master was no longer distracted by his fellow disciples. He grew even more stiff when Naruto rose and walked past and sat down beside him, ignoring the sniveling Daz, who had yet to pipe down about his incessant fear of the Titans. Buffoon! Didn't he understand what was happening here? What he was doing? His irrepressible fear was slowly but surely eating away at their resolve, at the strength of those who had survived. Of his students, yes. Morale was high here because Naruto had come to their rescue, but everywhere else there had been high casualties. Didn't Daz realize this? If he didn't shut his yap soon there was going to be a panic. Why yes, sensei? Jean gulped, mistaking the murderous intent in his master's eyes for himself. I wanted to ask you about. I don't want to fight the Titans anymore. Daz's sudden scream earned a start from both shinobi, drawing the blonde's ire. Kurama seemed to agree too. Noisy little shit. TCH, Naruto frowned in agreement. As I was saying, have you seen? It's over. Daz was still wailing. We're going to die. We're all. Yakamashi. Naruto struck down mercilessly at the recruit's head, driving Daz's face into the ground with such force that his body actually bounced from the motion. The sheer force of the strike sent him skidding across the ground for several meters, his limbs pinwheeling wildly, tumbling end over end before finally rolling to a halt at the edge of the upper wall. Marco barely managed to catch him in time before he sailed out into the abyss, before he plummeted down towards the eager titans below. The boy exclaimed, "What was that for, sensei? If he's going to bitch, then he can do it somewhere else." Naruto snarled, slamming his fist into the table. "I'm sick of cowards like him." At least the students didn't falter. They stood strong while buffoons like him were bawling their eyes out. They kept up the fight even when everyone else was devoured around them. Had he been paying more attention to his surroundings and said students, he might have noticed, of all those present Jean, Mina, Sasha, even Krista flushed with pride. Those were the first words of congratulation he'd ever spoken aloud since the day of graduation, and he'd said them now here before the eyes of the public. There's just something about that. Sensei's being a little rough today, isn't he? Krista murmured to Sasha. The brunette sighed and pushed a hand through her hair. She could understand Naruto's anger. She herself had nearly frozen up in the supply depot. If it weren't for his training she might have ended up Titan food. Thank Kami for ninjutsu and her earth affinity. When she'd failed her strike from the rafters and her blade had glanced across the shoulder instead of the neck, she'd nearly panicked. But then her training had kicked in. She'd successfully buried the 3-meter under a landslide of mud before it could even react, affording her just enough time to slice its neck. To the awe of her fellow classmates, that had been her first kill. She'd held herself together and everything had come out all right. Naruto had taught her that. Always keep cool under pressure, rely on your own strength, and if that failed you, rely on yours truly, he'd said. But who did Naruto rely upon? Sasha could tell. He was shouldering the burden of leadership, shouldering all those deaths himself so that others wouldn't have to accept the burden of responsibility. He'd been so many things to her in the last 3 years. Teacher, friend, obstacle, goal, but who had ever been something to him? I'm very grateful for all that you taught me. Sasha blinked at that, the memory coming back to her as she walked away from Krista, begging a half-hearted excuse. Why had she embraced him back then? At the time, the answer had seemed obvious. She'd been convinced that her sensei was about to die. But that was a lie, wasn't it? She'd known he wouldn't die. Naruto was too strong for that. But then Mikasa had kissed him, so had Mina, And yet she hadn't been able to even him or whisper soft words to him or do anything like Mikasa or Mina had. She didn't have the nerve, so she'd settled for a fierce embrace instead, unable to bring herself to do what she truly wanted. That Mikasa, I won't let her get a head start on me. Where's Mikasa and Armin? Naruto was questioning Jean as she approached. Marco having finally relieved him of that noisemaker. Didn't they make it up the wall with you? Jean blanched. They did, but… I see. Naruto nodded. A gag order, huh? Why am I not surprised? The brass would definitely do something like that in this situation. Let's see now. Where are he? Inclined his head. Eyes dusting with golden hue. That was Sanine mode. They're over that way, then. Great. They're all in one place. It makes things easier for me. Then, pulling a scroll forth from his pocket, he effortlessly garbed himself in a Spar Army uniform and cloak almost before Sasha could blink. He looked absolutely stunning in those cloak. The very picture of perfection as he walked away. But Naruto wasn't perfect. No, he was the furthest thing from it. He could be harsh, stubborn, foolish, even downright rash at times, and yet at others he could be impossibly kind. He didn't like to see others suffer, so he tried to shoulder everything at once, so that he might suffer instead of them. Was he still suffering now, she wondered? Back there, he promised he would save everyone, but he hadn't been able to keep his word in the end. So many had died. Only 20 out of 50 had actually made it up the wall. Perhaps that was why he'd put Jean in charge at the end. Because he felt he hadn't lived up to his promise? It was only then that Sasha realized she was still holding the loaf of bread and no one else was making any moves to follow Naruto. Chance. She bolted after him, long legs chewing up the distance between them, until Jean and the others were nothing but a memory. Naruto noticed her at the last instant. His head turning a fraction of an inch to regard her approach, he didn't have to look down, nearly her as much as he once had to meet her gaze. These last 3 years had given her more than just strength and skill. Sasha was taller now than the others, nearly as tall as him. The thought brought a small, secret smile to her face. Did you need something, Brows? Naruto didn't even break his stride as he spoke. It was up to her to force him to stop. You seemed a little tense back there. I wonder about that. His grim facade didn't soften in the slightest, nor did his brisk pace slacken. Was there something else? His message was clear. I don't want to talk about that. End of discussion. Sasha carefully ignored the warning signs and his body language, waited until they reached one of the few tents lining the walls. Then she moved. It wasn't a graceful trick by any means. She simply increased her pace a little until she got ahead of him, and then she stuck her foot out. The effect wasn't as disastrous as she thought it would be. The toe of Naruto's boot caught on her ankle, but instead of planting his face into the ground he stopped halfway and grabbed her by the arms, whipping her against the wall with enough force to crater the stone. Sasha silently thanked his training. That impact would have shattered the spine of a non-shinobi, as it were. Sasha felt only the faintest tingle in her back. She'd have a bad bruise tomorrow, but nothing more. Brows the hell? He glared at her, his eyes furious and crimson. What are you doing? Sensei here. Eyes downcast, Sasha lowered her head and thrust out her wrists, interposing the bread between his face and hers. It worked like a charm. Naruto froze, his anger frozen dead in its tracks. Apparently the significance of her gesture was not lost on him. Sasha never shared her food, ever. He glanced at her, down at the bread, then back to her, his hard eyes softening, if only marginally as he realized her intent. He took her by the wrist and pulled her closer, bringing the bread up to his face. To her disbelief, Naruto didn't take it out from her hand, quite the opposite. He ate it right out of her palm, his teeth sinking into the still warm bread and slowly pulling a chunk of it out, grazing her fingers as he pulled away. Despite her best efforts, Sasha felt herself flush. She knew he possessed untold strength, and yet there was something incredibly gentle about the way he'd done that, his eyes flicking up at her as he did so, that sent her heart fluttering, hammering against her chest like the drums of a great hunt, out for her blood. Ironic, considering she and her pa had once been hunters before she'd come inside the walls. Life is precious, treasure it while you can. Who knew what might happen after this? She might die in the coming counterattack, or worse, Sensei might die. Sasha knew firsthand just how powerful Naruto was. She'd once seen him get hit by a cannonball and get back up again, only muttering a half-hearted ouch to himself. Yes, he hadn't been hurt at all, but Mina had already told her an awful truth. Naruto had nearly died in a Titan's stomach only hours before. She might see him as strong, nearly invincible, but her teacher was all too mortal, if he were to die. Shit, Naruto said suddenly, you're crying. I didn't hurt you back there, did I? Huh? Sasha blinked, alarmed to find a single tear rolling down her cheek. I was? Before she could think to brush the droplet aside, he reached forward, snatching it up with his finger. 'Tis nothin', the words came out without pause or preamble, revealing her country accent. Ah. Sasha gasped, realizing her mistake. That is, I mean. Oh? His smile sent her blood boiling, in a good way. So that's how you really sound, eh? Why didn't you tell me about it before? It's kinda cute. Sasha didn't know why she kissed him, only that she did. It was as if someone had hijacked her body. The moment she heard that word, she was no longer in control of herself. One moment Naruto had her pressed against the wall with one hand, using the other to brush her tear away. The next, Sasha pivoted into him, shoving the bread into her back pocket, reversing their position. Naruto blinked, baffled by this flying act of thievery. But before he could speak, Sasha and her mouth met him in a frenzied rush, her tongue licking at his lips, silently asking for entry. Yes, Sasha didn't know why she'd kissed him, why she was still kissing him, when she knew there was a chance, a huge chance, that he'd only push her away. There was no way he could possibly care about someone so plain as her, so why hadn't she stopped? I know I can be an idiot at times, but this is too much. Why can't I just let go of him? There was just something about Uzumaki Naruto, something that drew her in, held her down, prevented her from even trying to think. She'd first felt it during her training when he'd taught her how to run, not as she'd run before, but to truly run, with every fiber of her being. Using these things he called the 8 gates. She dismissed it as folly before until he taught her. What a backlash. She hadn't been able to walk for nearly a month after opening just 3. Yes, Naruto had taught her all that and more, and yet now she was facing the distinct possibility of losing him, once and for all. Down, Sasha. She didn't want to think about those times anymore at all. She wanted to make a memory with him now, however tenuous it might be, before it was too late. And it already was too late. She could feel him beginning to respond to her now at long last, his mouth moving against hers, hands slipping from her face, moving to the still subtle curve of her shoulder, then her waist, looping round her to draw her in close. The heat of his body burned against her uniform like a furnace, forcing her legs to drift open. Mind if I cut in? Sasha froze. The sound of that voice sent chills shooting up and down her spine. Everything seemed to lurch beneath her, sending her mind into free fall. A deep sense of vertigo grabbed her, as if she were being dropped from a great height, and then it stopped. Her eyes fluttered open, her hands reached out for Naruto and found him gone. All that remained was the lingering scent of him, hanging against her nose, her skin still tingling from where he touched her. It served as a subtle reminder that he had been and still was quite present, wherever she was, here in this never-ending blackness. Where was she? What was this place? Turn, mortal, a deep, dark voice commanded her from behind, so that I might see you with my own eyes. Reluctantly, Sasha did so. Fear, awe, confusion, all these thoughts paled in comparison to the monstrosity looming before her. A fox. Sasha was staring at the king of all foxes, quite possibly the largest animal she'd ever seen, easily larger than a mountain. Its entire body bore a gleaming coat of crimson fur, 9 tails of pure scarlet laying lackadaisically behind it. Ruby red eyes bored into her, slitted pupils observed her every movement. At last, just when Sasha brows thought she would go mad with fear, it spoke. Hello, Sasha, it grinned, exposing row upon row of razor-sharp teeth, easily larger than her entire body. It's so nice to finally meet you face to face. Something about the way he said nice made Sasha shiver in genuine fear. Whomever this being was, he most certainly wasn't nice. Wuru? I? The great fox pretended to consider her question for a moment. I have been called many things, but for now, I suppose you may call me Kurama-sama. I reside within the boy you find yourself so verily smitten for, as do you at the moment. You mean I'm inside Naruto-sensei? Sasha felt her face heat through a million shades of scarlet. If her mind was here, then what the devil was her body doing out there? Surely she wasn't. Oh dear Kami. Inside the seal that contains me, Kurama corrected with a bemused growl, so more or less your consciousness is inside his stomach, and as for your body, how should I explain it? He tapped a claw to his forehead. I suppose you could say the time flow here is distorted. Every minute that passes here, only amounts to a singed second in the outside world. I only transferred a portion of yourself to the seal to speak with me, but my partner is bound to realize something's up sooner rather than later, so I suggest you make up your mind. I don't know whether to feel proud or insulted. I strongly suggest the former. A low growl grated across Sasha's ears. Too late she realized she'd crossed the line. The brat doesn't let just anyone set foot in this place. Only those he holds near and dear to his heart have ever entered here. If you wish it, I can always send you on your way and make you forget this ever happened. No! Sasha pleaded. Wait. Strange as it might seem, this could be her one and only chance to learn about her mentor. Oh? The demon fox arched an eyebrow, having second thoughts? Sasha resolutely ignored the subtle jibe. What can you tell me about Naruto-sensei? Do you know where he's from? What about his favorite ford? Or, silence. Kurama thrust a claw to her forehead, getting just that. If you want to know that badly, then I'll just show you. But I should warn you, he doesn't take kindly to others poking around in mine like this. He nearly killed the last one who did this, if your motives are less than pure. I want to see. Very well. Sasha instantly regretted that decision. Memories flowed into her mind like a river, one she couldn't afford to dam even if wanted to. Countless scenes of battle and bloodshed, trials and tribulations, friends who became enemies, of loves lived and lost, life and death dealt like the wind, always unexpected and inopportune. Just when she thought she couldn't handle any more, she was granted a glimpse of one last image. At the center of it all, a lonely little boy sitting on a swing, his fists clenched tight, his soul screaming with loneliness. Why won't anyone accept me? Gah! Sasha recoiled, clutching at her head, reeling from the sheer pain that accompanied the image. It had all felt so real. You truly are resilient, mortal, the fox mused, pouching to scratch at its head. You've probably got a bit of a Kimichi blood in you somewhere. It would explain your appetite. Is there more? Much more, Kurama snorted. But that's not why you're here. It's not. No, he replied. I've summoned you to this place to give you a warning, and a gift. Sure you have. More and more Sasha brows felt her normally cheery demeanor beginning to slip. Having endured the deaths of her comrades was one thing. To deal with an insane, perverted fox was another. Now in the haze of Naruto's memories still clogging her mind, she'd become almost despondent. How could one person endure so much suffering and still remain so kind-hearted? So pure? Throughout it all, that had been more than a constant. In all his years he'd remained, and would continue to remain, an unrelenting force for good. It seems my host has taken an interest in you, Kurama continued, ignoring her deadpans. Among others, they do not interest me. What does interest me is thus: who will be the one to succeed him? 8 of you there are, and yet I sense that one of you will die before today is done. That makes 7. My host is not yet aware of this fact, so I thought I should take precautions to make sure you don't lose your life in the next few hours. You don't exactly strike me as the cautious type. 8? Sasha wasn't listening. She was still reeling at the kitsune's implication. It didn't make any sense. Naruto had only trained 7. Why, you're lying. Sensei doesn't keep secrets. Am I now? Kurama replied, sneering in the face of her confusion. Well, it doesn't matter if you believe me or not about my host's secret student, but I'll give you his name and way. Marco Bot. Didn't you know? He's the only one amongst you who actually knows senjutsu. I suppose Naruto finally recognized his own mortality last year and decided to start training a successor. Regardless of that fact, one of you will be dead before the sun sets. It may be you. It may be Marco. It might even be that Gene boy. I don't know, little mortal. Personally, I think it would be troublesome to have any of you die. You and the others are one of the few things that keep him from losing his mind. But even I cannot alter fate. I can only influence it. Now stretch out your hand and make a fist. Sasha did so without hesitation, resolutely extending her hand and clenching her fingers. Now what? This. Kurama met her small fist with his own, his giant knuckles pressing against her hand. Sasha felt something shift in her stomach. Then there was only pain. Once more she thanked Naruto for his intensive trainings. She was able to endure the agony with only a soft hiss escaping her lips as the fire seared through her veins. It was as if a fire had been lit somewhere deep within her belly, slowly spreading to the rest of her body with an excruciating slowness. Somehow, she managed to rasp out a question. What the? I've lent you 1/4 of my chakra, Kurama told her, lips parting to reveal teeth set back in a snarl. Now in a way, You're like that Ackerman wench, minus the filthy Uchiha blood, of course. I don't care how diluted it might be, just the smell of her makes me sick. It may burn now, but you'll thank me later if you get in a tight spot. Tongues of white-hot fury licked across every inch of her even as he spoke. She could see the red chakra emanating from her stomach to scrawl out across her skin in a strange sort of cloak. Oh God, it was really starting to hurt now. Awawo, you should be grateful, mortal. She could barely hear the beast's words over the pain. It's not often I waste my own energy on peons such as you. And then it was over. The chakra receded into the pit of her stomach in a rush, leaving Sasha sore, but still standing. Ow, she snarled, glaring at him. You piece of bold little one. Kurama commended her courageous fortitude with a grunt. You come from a strong blooding. Your chakra coils are many times more resilient than the others, stronger, even, I think, than that wench who holds the last of the Uchiha blood. I see now why you were taught you to use the 8 gates. To think, he's already attracted 3 others like you. 4? She knew Mikasa and Mina counted, as well as herself, but who else was there? That crazy Hanji bitch doesn't count. To her mild amusement, the fox actually shuddered. Honestly, I don't know if she wants to dissect Naruto or rape him. I've never met a more frightening human in all my life. Not since Madara. I know. Who is this Hanji-san? Sasha asked, her curiosity piqued despite the dismay she felt. She vaguely recalled hearing that name as part of the Recon Corps. The most evil woman alive. Kurama whimpered. Don't believe anything she says. It's all lies, I tell you. Lies. I see. Sasha was feeling more than a little strange by now. Her vision was beginning to blur, and her head now felt as if someone had taken a Titan-sized hammer to it. It was probably best if she left here before her sensei realized just where she was. That's why I've taken such an interest in you. The 9-tailed fox leaned forward, its snout now mere inches away from hers. You were one of the closest things this world had to a shinobi before that blonde idiot activated your coils. You were a hunter when you were younger, were you not? But I digress. This form must frighten you. Allow me to assume a more tolerable shape. Crimson light swirled about the kitsune as it drew back, its fur and snout slowly receding, claws assuming the shape of fingers, paws receding into the shape of open-toed sandals. Sasha stepped back as the shadows coalesced around him, watching in awe as his body shrank and assumed human proportions in the blink of an eye. Now that he'd finally, Sasha found herself staring at a darker version of Naruto. His hair was still blonde but longer, more matted around the edges. Whisker marks that had once tripled his cheeks were now rough gouges on either side of his face. When he looked at her, smiled at her, she could see his sharp teeth, and she knew that although this might look like Naruto, this was not Naruto. The brunette struggled to remember that, but to no avail. Her mind might know that this wasn't Naruto, but her body didn't. Besides, she was already lost in those deep crimson orbs. Better? Kurama asked with Naruto's voice. Cripes. He even sounded like him. A little. Naruto no. Kurama looked her up and down, a thoughtful smirk pulling at the corners of his feral face. Interesting. What are you smiling at? Oh, nothing. The demon shook its head. You see, it's been so long since I took human form, and as such, I find myself in a certain mood. As a matter of fact, I've just thought of a wonderful way for you to repay me for my little gift. Earlier, he pinioned her with his gaze, rendering her body insensate with a single glance. Then he started forward, one step at a time, slowly closing the gap between them. Wait, what was he doing? Were he seriously trying to know? Oh, sweet God, no. He wouldn't dare. Oh, but he would. And now she was powerless to retreat. All Sasha's training was stripped away beneath his gaze as though she'd never had any to begin with. When she tried to call upon her chakra, none came. Wait. Stop. Sasha pleaded. What are you doing? Claiming my reward, of course, Kurama replied. Besides, he reached out and grabbed her by the arm, drawing her close to him, nudging her chin to meet his. If that idiot wants to indulge in a little pleasure, where's the harm in doing it myself? But you can't. She struggled to reason with him. You're not Naruto, aren't I? We practically share the same soul now, the boy and I. His grip was like a vice around her waist now, drawing her body into his, forcing her terrified eyes to meet his bemused gaze. All those secret thoughts he daren't let surface, all those desires he never acts upon manifested in me. Stop it! His lips were close to hers now, perilously close. It's almost as if, What the hell are you doing, Baka Kitsune? Sasha startled out of Kurama's arms as Naruto's voice exploded into life behind her, punctuated by gale force winds strong enough to shatter the darkness surrounding them. She whirled in a panic, flabbergasted to find him standing only yards away, his face frozen in a rictus of furious anger. Couldn't wait, could ya, kid? Kurama chortled roughly, his true voice echoing in the empty open space. And here I was just about to have a little fun on your behalf. Naruto said nothing. He simply continued to stare at his darker half. Now's not the time for this, Kurama, he said at last. On the contrary, the fox disagreed. Now's the perfect time to ensure your legacy, that is. Naruto bristled. What did you do? Kurama laughed. Why don't you ask the wench? Naruto didn't ask her. Instead he cocked his head, as though listening to a voice in his head. Abruptly, he rounded on her. A low growl left his lips. Sasha. The brunette gulped despite herself, suddenly nervous in the wake of his gaze. Naruto. I can explain. Out, he hissed at her. Now. A small gasp fled from her lips as something jerked her backwards and out of the seal. When next she opened her eyes she found herself back in the outside world. Naruto glaring bloody red daggers at her. Found herself being held at arm's length. His eyes were wide and disbelieving, his features rough, sharp, and absolutely furious. Why were his eyes crimson? Sasha had never seen him this angry before. Come to think of it, she'd never seen him angry before. At all. Ever. The closest she'd come to seeing him angry was when she'd occasionally stolen his food during mess hall. And even that paled in comparison to this. Sensei, I didn't mean to. Didn't mean to do what? Like an iron trap, Naruto's gaze locked onto Sasha's own. The sheer intensity of his stare, the sudden ice in his expression, was enough to silence her. Nay, the entire camp, nothing moved, nothing at all. And then he spoke, voice black as pitch, eyes cold as the coldest winter. I have spent, he began softly, 3 years training you, Sasha, teaching you, breaking you down and rebuilding you from the ground up, making you stronger than you've ever been. And not once have I pried into your past, not once have I asked any questions you'd find uncomfortable, and not once have I gone skulking behind your back, poking around in your brain and doing things that shouldn't be done. The sage's voice had been rising with each syllable. Now he was practically shouting at her, red in the face, practically choking on the words. You went inside my mind. I'd expected the same courtesy from my favorite disciple. His words caught the ear of everyone nearby. Sasha was suddenly aware of everyone staring at her. She was only thankful that they'd left Jean and the others behind. This was so embarrassing. But not nearly so much as being caught with her hand in the cookie jar, both literally and figuratively. Favorite. The brunette flinched back and aside, stung by his words, and yet at the same time, oddly vindicated. His favorite? She'd always assumed Mikasa was Naruto's #1 pupil. Her grades certainly indicated as much, but now that she thought about it, he'd spent the least amount of time with Mikasa. She'd been a natural, taking to chakra like a duck to water. Sasha, on the other hand, had not. Naruto had been forced to drill both her body and mind until she caught up to the others. He'd often said that she reminded him of himself when he was young, having to work through so much to become the masterful sage he was now. More than once he'd also compared her to someone named Rock Lee, noting that she made up for her faults through sheer persistence. This time, that persistence had backfired, horrifically. I was your favorite? She asked Naruto, her words little more than the most naked of whispers. Was being the operative term. Venom dripped in his words, caustic enough to peel rust off a blade. Not anymore. Not after that stunt you just pulled. He drew back from her with a hiss. You know what? Leave. I don't care where you go, or what you do, just get away from me. His head jerked away from her in disgust. I can't even bear to look at you right now. But You what? Naruto all but growled. You'd better have a damned good excuse for poking around in my head like that. Browse. I just wanted to know more about you. Now it was Naruto's turn to jerk back. He did so as though she'd slapped him across the face, eyes wide. He hadn't been expecting that answer. You what? He rasped. I wanted to know about you. Sasha could feel the tears coming now, and she didn't even try to stop them. They were pouring out of her eyes faster than she could hope to dry them, flowing into her mouth, rendering her words watery and weak. Your likes, your dislikes. Where you came from. What you want to be. How you came to save us when you could have saved everyone else. Why you feel you have to shoulder everything and take all the blame, all the responsibility even when it's not your fault? I didn't want you to deal with it all alone. Is that so wrong? She could feel herself slipping back into her old accent again, but by now she was angry, far too angry to care. Is it so wrong that someone as plain and stupid and simple as me actually cares enough about you to risk pissing you off? God, I'm so stupid. All I ever do is burden you, for crying out, MMPH? Her eyes bulged as Naruto's lips collided with hers, stealing her words away. It wasn't a rough kiss by any mean, his mouth simply caged hers, stifling all sound. His palms cupped her cheeks with an infinite tenderness, cradling her face as though it were made of the finest china. You are not, he whispered, pulling away, a burden. Sasha was baffled. How could Naruto-sensei go from being furious to kissing her speechless? Are you what? Sorry, he apologized, his words sorrowed and contrite. That was rash of me, I shouldn't have shouted at you. He gazed at her for a long moment and to her infinite relief, nodded. You really are too honest to lie, aren't you, Sasha? If you were worried about me, you should have just said so. There was no need for you to go inside my head. You saw something ugly, something I wanted to keep hidden, up in my memories. He turned aside and she could see the anger twisting at his normally placid face, warping his features into a livid mask of rage not directed at her but elsewhere. I fucking hate when people screw with my head, even if they claim it's for a good reason. So, abruptly, his gaze snapped back towards her. Was it for a good reason? Were you really willing to risk death for me by taking on that much chakra? Sasha couldn't help it. She blanched. You knew about that, huh? I know Kurama has his reasons for doing whatever he does, Naruto replied, laying his hand upon her stomach, fingertips digging into the taut flesh beneath. Doesn't mean I have to agree with them. Now I have to make sure he didn't fuck up your chakra coils. This might burn a bit. Turned out he was right. Sasha felt her face begin to burn all over again. She didn't care if Naruto was looking at her chakra coils or not. This was still supremely awkward. A thread of warmth from her stomach and spooled down between her legs in an instant, leaving her weak-kneed and woozy. Was this actually turning her on? If he kept this up, if she would. Sensei, Naruto purred back at her. Stop that right now. Sheesh, you really are honest. Naruto's laugh tore through her haze of pleasure like a thief in the night. Naughty, Sasha, naughty. Do I have to punish you for thinking such things? He took his hand away from her stomach and brought it towards her inner thigh, curling her leg up against him. As swiftly as his smile had come, so too did it vanish, shattering like so much glass. He cocked his head aside at her, his blue eyes flashing in the setting sun as he took his hand away and stood to his full height. When he spoke this time, his words were serious and somber. So now you know my dirty little secret. I've got a monster inside me, and you should also know why I'd prefer to keep that under wraps. He turned his gaze down to the recruits below. I've already learned my lesson the hard way. If I were ever to unleash my full power inside the walls, everyone would die. Not just the Titans, not just the people, everyone, everything. I transformed briefly 3 years ago, and I nearly scared everyone half to death. If I'd had my way, no one would know about the truth of what I am. But now that you've gone and stuck your nose where it doesn't belong, and here he did flick her with his finger, I suppose I'll have to trust you with that secret. That secret? Unbidden, her mind flashed back to that mysterious Titan she'd seen, running away from them and into the city. You mean there's... Naruto laughed at her. It was a deep, throaty sound. Really, do you think I'm going to tell you after the emotional hangover you just gave me? You're persistent, Sasha. But then again, he leaned forwards, musing her hair with a hand, that's what makes you who you are. You can't change that any more than you can keep the sun from setting. And you shouldn't try. Without another word he was gone and past her, striding away as though their little heart-to-heart had never been a consequence at all. When he paused, she was momentarily taken aback. Sasha, hold the rest of that bread for me until I get back. You were right about one thing. He was suddenly in front of her again, leaning in, lips brushing against hers for all of an instant. I'm fucking starving. Whatever else her sensei might have said was cut off by the sharp discharge of a cannon. Naruto turned as he once more felt the faint tingle in the back of his brain. The sign of a Hiraishin kunai being activated, he spun away from her with a delighted cackle, leaving her cheeks alight in 7 shades of scarlet. Guess that's my cue. A golden flash was the only indication of movement, then Naruto was gone, off to wreak havoc and defy fate as only he could. It was only then that Sasha realized something. In all the confusion and their heated argument, she hadn't thought to give him Kurama's warning, moments earlier. "I'm human, I see," Kit's Verman murmured to himself, his terrified gaze never once leaving that of Eren Jiger's. "Don't resent me for this, brat, it's only natural. No one can prove that you're not a demon." Slowly, he raised his arm, fingers pressed into a single point. He took no pleasure in their grief-stricken faces, but in the end, his fear won out. They had to be killed. They had to be. Now. This very instant. There was just no way that this whelp could be an ally. Not at all. He had to die. Without thinking, he slashed his arm downward. Fire! There was a deafening bang, punctuated by a wet popping sound, a sulfuric scent reaching everyone's nose as it discharged its payload. Eren watched, helpless, poised between biting his thumb and screaming in horror as the massive iron ball hurtled towards him and his friends. Out of the corner of his eye he could see Mikasa reaching for what looked like a kunai, her fingers wrapping around its sealed hilt. There came a faint sucking sound, then, belay that order. Suddenly and without warning, an angel came down from heaven. There could be no other word for that blazing blonde blur, its figure sheathed in golden radiance, its eyes burning like hot coals in its skull. It seemed to hang there in the sky for a moment, invisible wings holding it aloft on streamers of golden light. Then the angel did the inexplicable, the unthinkable, thrusting itself firmly between the three cadets and the approaching shot with arms splayed, intercepting the cannonball and shattering it. Eren saw it all in that instant. Their savior raised a hand and bit down. Hard, blood spurted and took solid form. Something massive grew around them in recompense for his temerity, and the cannonball simply broke against its palm. It flew apart into 1,000 different pieces, sparing shards of debris in every direction, some of which struck the pig-headed instructor who'd ordered them to fire on him in the first place, knocking him from his perch in a shower of bloods, karma at its finest. Grunts of pain and screams of untold agonies echoed through the cloud of rust and rotten dust. He didn't need to see to know that panic must be unfolding beyond his line of sight. "The things I do for you kids," a gruff voice hissed. Mikasa gasped in confusion. Eren sympathized. In the silence that followed, Jiger found himself staring at the wings of freedom emblazoned upon a cloak, the bright white-blue emblem of the Survey Corps proudly standing between him and certain death. But what was a member of the Corps doing here? It didn't make any sense. They'd all gone out on an expedition just this morning. There was no way they could have returned in such a short time. He peered up into the smoke to no avail, unable to make out the face of his rescuer in the haze created by the cannonball's explosion. "Do not lose your composure, Eren Jiger," that same voice continued, speaking to him and him alone. "Do not break your stance, stretch out your awareness. Don't let your guard down for even a single second, and take that hand away from your mouth before you do something foolish. These imbeciles are ready to kill you at even the slightest provocation, and I'd rather not any more of my students die today." "Sensei?" Mikasa blinked, trying to peer into the haze. It was then that Eren realized something else. This so-called angel, this man mistaken for divinity, wasn't an angel at all. He knew him, recognized him. Although this man had not taught him the shinobi arts, he'd been responsible for beating the brutal art of hand-to-hand combat into him for the last 3 years all the same. As if on cue, the smoke began to dissipate, revealing the figure of the one standing over him. Eyes the color of blue diamond peered down at him, past him, through him, staring into his very soul. "Naruto? No, Kurosaki Ichigo." They snapped back. "Who do you think I am?" Faced with the blonde sarcasm, Jiger faltered. "I don't even know who that is. Goddammit shit." The blonde was complaining now, waving his still steaming hand about for the three of them to see. "That really hurt, you know. Seriously. Could have blown my arm off back there if I wasn't careful. Jiger, the least you can do is apologize to my poor hand for putting it in this damn situation." Even as Naruto spoke, Eren could see the massive construct sheathing his limb. It was as if a giant hand had sprouted forth from nothingness to protect them, and he was waving the damn thing around as though it were some kind of toy. "Naruto, what is—" "Oh, Mikasa!" Their teacher turned, as though just seeing her. "Thanks for activating the kunai back there. I might not have made it in time otherwise." "No, I don't think that's the problem here." Mikasa pointed, his eyes wide. "Your hand?" Naruto followed his student's gaze, watched flesh knitting back together on his fingers. muscle and skin growling over the skeletal hand that he'd sprouted to defend them. Within seconds, the massive hand was entirely untouched, as though it had always been. "Aw," he groaned in understanding. "Shit, did I do that? Damned, first Sasha, and now this. I just can't seem to keep a lid on things today." "Don't worry about that, Mikasa-chan." With a grunt, he pulled his hand free of the monstrous limb. "Since the cat's already out of the bag, guess I'ma have to say it, I'm like Eren." "Like Eren? A shifter?" Naruto said it as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. Eren gawped at him as if he'd grown another head, to which the blonde simply sighed. "Well, I had been hoping to avoid telling everyone about my little secret, but thanks to your little stunt back there," he turned his gaze back to the rapidly fading fog and the figures standing beyond. "I don't think that's possible anymore." Deprived of what strength it needed, the artificial limb began to collapse around them in great gouts of steam, kicking up still more dust and debris. "Now I sincerely hope the three of you have some sort of plan to get out of this with your skin intact, because I've got absolutely nothing." "Armin? And me? You mean you haven't put that brilliant brain of yours to work yet?" Naruto questioned. "I was expecting more out of my most brilliant student." "I'm not that." "Of course you are. You're a frickin' genius." Armin started in surprise as his mentor jerked forward, thrusting his face before him. "Don't you remember? You mastered the basics of chakra in a day. It took everyone else a week. Even Mikasa didn't learn that quickly. You may not be the most resilient, but you learn the most jutsu as well. You're not a burden. Your friends think the same. Stop underestimating yourself." Armin knelt there, the words soaking in. "Not a burden? TCH. Looks like I've got no choice now." Naruto sighed. "Armin, I'll buy you some time. Come up with a plan before I get shot, will ya?" Without another word he strode forward, making his way out of the smoke. Armin watched him go, watched his sensei stride to the death. Had he been doubting himself all along? Was it all in his head? If so, was he really handicapping himself? He glanced at Mikasa and Eren, saw the resolve there in their eyes. "It was all in my head. They never thought of me like that at all." Naruto knew none of these thoughts. He kept walking, slowing only when a shape from the smoke resolved beside him. "I'm coming with you," Mikasa's voice, then her figure, resolved beside him. There was a hard glint to her eyes, one Naruto recognized all too well. "Remind you of someone? Urusai, I'm not talking to you after that stunt you pulled with Sasha. It worked, didn't? Was the Kishin's counter. You finally opened up to someone. Stubborn," he muttered to Kurama, as much as Mikasa, quietly pushing a palm against his forehead. "I'm doing this for your sake as much as Eren's. Besides, shouldn't you be more worried about him anyway? He's your brother after all, and the only one you have left at that. I'm just someone who happened to teach you a few things." Unbidden, his mind flashed back to their kiss back on the rooftop. "What the hell is with these kids? They're so damn willful." "Yes, you're just my sensei," the blackhead replied blandly to his statement. "Nothing can change that." "Good, glad you see things my way." Her hand lashed out, snaring him by the wrist and grinding him to a halt. But I only have one of you, too," she finished with a raise of her gaze, dark eyes boring into his, clashing with his. "And I know it's selfish of me to say this, but I don't want to lose you either." Slowly, she wrapped her hand around his, pushing her fingertips between his own. "Is that so wrong, sensei?" Naruto growled, a hiss snaking through his clenched teeth, a muscle jumping in his jaw. "You stubborn, willful little—" "I'm coming," she repeated, the slightest of smirks pulling at her lips. She knew she'd already won. "Can you really afford to waste time trying to stop me? God's girl, you remind me of Sasuke way too much. TCH, do what you will." He stormed forward into the haze, leaving her to follow. The dust and debris parted for him, giving way to his furious pace. Verman was there waiting for them as they departed the choking haze. His already pallid complexion became positively gray once he laid eyes upon the seething sage. "Stop!" he cried. Naruto didn't stop. He continued his relentless advance, his long legs eating up the distance between them. Sweating bullets, the captain ordered his men to raise their rifles. "Stop or I'll shoot!" Finally, the blonde slowed to a halt, a mere 3 yards away. "Uzumaki! What is the meaning of this?" "I could ask you the same question, Verman." There could be no mistaking the deliberate insult in the blonde's tone. "Where do you get off firing on my students like that?" "Silence!" The slimy little man backpedaled in the face of Naruto's malevolence. "You have no authority here." He was beginning to panic now. The shrapnel had inflicted more than its fair share of wounds upon him. his metal state left hanging by a mere thread. His left eye was already beginning to swell up and his sword arm was bleeding from a nasty gash that would surely become infected if not treated forthwith. Did the last sage care? He did not. I have every authority, Naruto replied, his words growing colder still as he reached for a blade. I may serve with the Scouting Legion, but my orders come from the monarchy. If I see someone at fault, I may correct them, and you, my good sir, are most certainly at fault. You've fired on 3 trainers without so much as hearing their side of the story. I could court-martial you for that, no. I could kill you right now and no one would bat so much as an eyelash. Slowly, almost casually, he pulled his sword free, and in an instant, laid its edge upon Verman's bleeding arm. Is that what you want, Ackerman? Realizing his own peril, Verman rounded on the rookie instead. What does your boyfriend have to do with this? BB boyfriend? Mikasa felt her cheeks begin to burn. Of all the times to bring this up. He's my sensei, sir. Lies. Verman shrieked. We have witnesses. You were seen kissing him atop the roof of the bell tower. Relationships between ranking officers and cadets are forbidden. Explain yourself. Mikasa opened her mouth to deny it, to refuse the truth, only to find herself silenced by a finger to the lips. Mikasa, Naruto smiled serenely down at her. What did I teach you about dogs? That got a blink from his pupil, that the weakest ones always bark the loudest. Naruto nodded sagely. Very good. And as you know, sometimes some dogs need a muzzle. Verman's single eye went wide as his right arm was severed from his body, the limb now falling away from him in a flash. The fingers were wriggling slightly as the nerve endings within them struggled to receive signal from his brain once more. Dropping the sword that they once held as his hand groped on blindly, he lunged backwards, his left arm stretched out in a vain attempt to staunch the blood flow. Yewawag! The man tried to scream, tried to grab and wield his fallen blade. Uzumaki Naruto buzzed into view, his body blocking the man's weapon, his eyes glaring out coldly from behind a veil of golden light. With a hiss, he swung his arm backwards, a streak of golden light rocketing out from the tip of his fingers and incinerating both the captain's arm and his sword within the bright energy. He didn't even give the man time to retaliate. His boots barreled forward and drove the buffoon back a dozen paces in the blink of an eye, increasing the distance between them. Now then, Naruto sheathed his bloody blade with a sigh. Unless you'd like to lose your other arm, I suggest you refrain from such audacious accusations and return to the matter at hand. Silence. I will not tolerate this insubordination. The blonde shrugged. Then I'll just take your other arm then. Wait. Stop. Naruto turned his head aside, regarding the boy's sudden immersion from the steam behind him. Good boy, he mused softly to himself. He's finally come up with something. It's a shame, though. Another second and I'd been rid of this buffoon for good. Eren isn't the enemy of mankind, Armin declared. We're willing to share all the intelligence we've gathered. Begging for your lives is useless now. He revealed his truth from in front of us. There's nothing left to say. If you say he's not an enemy, prove it. If you can't do that, I will eliminate the threat. So, Naruto thought, he thinks that was Eren back there, not me. And he's still driven by fear despite losing his arm. Interesting. I might not have to do anything after all. There's no need for further proof. Armin barked. It's unnecessary. The issue isn't how we see him. What? Armin risked a glance at his teacher, and received Naruto had done nothing to interrupt him so far. Sensei trusted him. He could do this. You said everybody saw him. He continued, plowing on in the face of adversity. Then they must have seen him fighting those titans too. And they must have seen all the titans ganging up on him. Don't you understand it now? They see him as prey, just like the rest of mankind. Nothing you say can change that fact. Murmurs of disbelief rippled through the ranks. Soldiers lowered their blades, pulled their fingers from the triggers of their rifles. That's true. A titan as an ally. That can't be. For a moment, just a moment, Armin hoped that they'd see reason here. It didn't last. Prepare to attack. Verman screeched. Don't fall for this clever trap. Their actions have always been beyond our comprehension. If they can transform into humans and speak our language, that's just another way for them to fool us. We can't let them do as they please. No good. He stopped thinking entirely. No. He's too scared to think. He risked a glance back at Eren and Mikasa, and his courage returned. I have to do this. Almost before he knew what he was doing, Armin had slammed a fist into his chest, standing tall and proud despite his trembling knees. As a soldier, I swore to devote my heart to the resurrection of mankind. There is no greater glory than dying for that belief. If we added his titan power to the might of our armies, it might even be possible to recapture the town. For the glory of the human race of our race, I beg you. In my final moments before I die, permit me to explain his strategic importance. There was a silence, and then, to everyone's horror, Verman began to raise his hand. This was it. He was going to fire on them again. That was a good try, Armin. Arlette startled as a hand settled upon his shoulder, momentarily alarmed to find Naruto scowling on the man ahead of them. But I'm afraid it didn't work, see? The poor fool's gone and lost his feeble little mind. Taking his hand from his student's arm, he started forward, his expression unreadable, his eyes hidden in those rough blonde bangs. He's too scared to think anymore, so it'd be better if I showed him the power you're talking about, for real this time. As sensei? Or as scum, Naruto called up at Kit's Verman. You wanted proof that Eren's on your side, right? Well then, watch this. Sighing, Naruto raised a hand to his face, bit down on his thumb. Hard. Mikasa and Armin braced themselves as best they could against the flash of life. But there could be no bracing against the monster that strode forth from that flash. It was as if Naruto's human form was just a shell, as flimsy and fragile as a caterpillar's cocoon, and the creature that emerged from this chrysalis, the result of this metamorphosis, could only be described in a single words, with its great towering height and 6 arm, long blonde hair, scarlet eyes and armored arms, a maw bristling with razor-sharp teeth. Yes, there was only one word to describe this azure-like entity. Monster. Screams of horror and dismay rose up from those assembled, nearly deafening Eren and the others. Witnessing a partial transformation was one thing, but to see a full-blown titan standing there before them in all of its malevolent might was another thing entirely. Soldiers scrambled backwards as Naruto towered over them, his jaws creaking, opening before an exhalation of sin-cider steam. Armin felt his heart sink into his stomach. No way. Naruto, what? Mikasa gawped up at the towering titan, and yet she felt no fear. There was only awe. She remembered it now. This was the same titan who had handed Eren to them back in the square, the aberrant who hadn't attacked them. This then was Naruto. Unbelievable. Yeah, it's me, he growled, lowering his head to look her in the eye. Sorry for deceiving you back there. Are you afraid? The blackhead gazed back at him and asked herself that very same question. Did this big beast frighten her? No, she knew this was Naruto. Just as she knew Naruto would never lay a hand on his disciples. She shook her head slowly, raven tresses bobbing from the motion. Stifling her anxiety, she stepped forward, placing a hand upon Naruto's massive ankle. His skin was searing to the touch, severe in its heat, and yet she felt nothing but comfort. No, she said softly, I'm not afraid of you. As expected from a descendant of the Uchiha, the titan chortled softly, turning to face the cowering Verman. You really do have ice in your veins. Mikasa had no idea what an Uchiha was, but she chose to take that as a compliment. This the power that Eren and I possess. Naruto bellowed, his words crashing down around them like thunder. The power that can seal the breach and reclaim the town. Shoot me if you must, but if you do it won't end well for any of you. Beside him, Ian paused. If it was true, if Naruto Dano really could control this titan, Captain, we should consider WH. Silence. If Verman had been beyond reason before, then he was practically frantic now. Staring up into those sinister scarlet orbs, staring into the eyes of a titan, pushed him past his breaking point. Prepared to fire all rounds at once on my signal. His arm rose and fell in what felt like slow motion, his eyes wide and fearful as Naruto surged forward to intercept the incoming can of fire. No matter how they plead for their lives, they're still rebels. Traitors. I bet those other two are titans as well. Yes, they must be. That makes them the enemy. Those who threaten the safety of mankind must be killed without hesitation. They must be eliminated. That's what it means to be a soldier. His arm snapped down. Cut it out already. All eyes turned to find Verman restrained, and hand holding him at the elbow, preventing his arm from dropping any further. The one responsible was an aged, unassuming man in uniform, his only distinguishing feature being the red sash worn around said uniform and his deep hazel eyes. His mustache quirked in a slight smile as he held Verman back. Every man, woman, and child knew this man. Commander of the Southern Territories and esteemed general by far. You haven't changed at all, the elderly fellow continued. As big as you are, you've still got the guts of a scared fawn. Verman gasped, Commander Pixis. And there, standing beside him, and possibly, was Annie? So that's where she was. Armin realized, unmoving. Sensei, did you have this planned out all along? No, that can't be right. He wouldn't risk our lives like that, would he? He risked a glance back at Naruto's Titan form. His fellow blonde appeared smug, but there could no mistaking the brief uncertainty that flickered through his eyes. That settled it then. His master was just as baffled by Pixis's arrival and Annie's presence as he. Did he too know just how lucky they were? Can't you see how magnificent his salute is? Pixis said as he strode forward toward Armin, heedless of Naruto's Titan standing only yards away. I just arrived, but the situation has already been relayed to me by this young lady over here. He indicated Annie with a nod. You go organize the reinforcements. I think it'd be worthwhile to hear what they've got to say. But, that wasn't a question, Captain. Pixis's tone was kind, but it left no room for further argument. Dismissed. Verman slinked off, tail between his legs. To his credit, the commander waited until the coward was well out of earshot before finally clearing his throat. Uzumaki Naruto, I presume? Pixis continued, addressing the giant. Naruto nodded. Would you mind stepping out of that body for a moment? Pixis asked. I'm afraid you're frightening my troops back there, unless you have any objections? Naruto's Titan did something impossibly human just then, crossing all 6 arms before its chest. What guarantee do I have that you won't open fire anyway? It spoke. One of the soldiers gasped. I'm a Hinata in it, thank you very much. Naruto's deadpan was barely concealed. Don't compare me to the rest of those Titans. As I've already said before, I have control of this form. Now, he turned his towering form back to the commander. Answer my question. What's to stop your boys from trying to kill me the moment I step out of this body? As things stand, I think it's rather obvious they'd sooner see me dead. Surely you can understand that we are both men of principle here? Pixis sighed as he pulled a flask from his coat pocket and took a long, hard draught. I've absolutely no intention of causing you or your students any harm here. I certainly don't plan on opening fire like that buffoon Verman did. And as you can see, I'm rather fond of my arms, so no, I don't think I'll be harming you or Jiga-kun over there any time soon. You should do something about cowards in your ranks, Annie seconded icily. Agreed, my dear. Pixis smiled at Annie as he replaced the flask within his coat pocket. By all means, your teacher is free to mete out whatever discipline he may deem necessary. But please, don't kill the man. Dead soldiers are bad for morale. You understand. Now, would you kindly come out of there, Uzumaki-kun? Sure. The nape of his neck began to bulge and writhe as the man within fought for emergence. Soldiers squirmed restlessly as an arm appeared, followed by a leg, pursued by a torso. Slowly, but surely, Naruto's human form wrested itself free of the Titan's flesh, inch by painful inch. He hadn't been kidding when he'd said it was a bitch to reemerge. On his own, it took at least a few minutes, time in which he was left vulnerable to enemy fire and grasping hands. Then with a sickening squelching sound, Uzumaki Naruto burst from the back in a shower of gore. He alighted soundlessly between Eren and Mikasa, shaking himself like a wet dog. Gah, he grumbled, I really hate that part. Pixis arched an eyebrow at the sight. Interesting. Jiger can do the same, Naruto replied, dusting himself off, although he probably doesn't have the same level of control as me. So you can control it? Naruto turned his head to regard she who had spoken, one Rico Brzezinska. The silver-haired girl was peering at him intently, as though she expected him to snap and eat her at any moment. It was almost laughable, to a fault. Ever since he'd met her on the wall 3 years before he'd been made aware/known of her fear for all things Titan. Then again, those fears were all too understandable. He needed to remind individuals like her that he meant them no harm. Needed to remind these soldiers that he was on their side, before someone did something stupid and got everyone killed. He could feel Annie's gaze boring into his back. If he was going to reveal that she still was a Titan shifter, now was the time. Even now, her crystalline eyes were silently pleading with him for silence. Idiot, Kurama groused sullenly. You're gonna shoulder everything again, aren't you? Naruto mentally sighed, agreeing with his partner for what felt like the first time in a century. Yes, he was an idiot. Without a second thought, he readily affirmed, I'm the only other shifter within the walls though. Annie's soft gasp barely reached his ears. Oh? Pixis smiled strangely at this remark, unknowing of the crisis that had just been averted. Well then, if your level of control is as high as you claim, perhaps you and Jiga-kun can assist me with a plan I've been formulating. These students of yours might have a pivotal role to play as well, he said as his gaze glided to Mikasa and Armin. I believe there were 8 of them, correct? Naruto frowned. He didn't like where this was going, not at all. The commander was suggesting that he endanger the lives of his precious disciples for a second time, and for what? Naruto had no way of knowing. How could that sit well with him? And what plan might that be? He asked guardedly. Pixis's smile was practically beatific. Why, to reclaim Trost, of course. There was a silence. Finally, Naruto sighed. Got anything to drink? He asked at length. Pixis offered him his flask. The blonde gladly accepted it from the man's hands and took a long, deep draught. Burning liquid coursed down his throat and warmed his belly, lending him just a touch of solace. Naruto had the succinct feeling he'd be needing a drink or two before this day was done. Gasping, he proffered it back to the commander. Strong stuff, he choked out. I only drink the best. Pixis offered him a slight smile. Naruto sighed as he followed. We're in for one wild night. Annie was waiting for him after their strategy session atop the wall, her cold eyes seeking his the minute she realized he was alone. A plan had been made, though she herself questioned the validity of it. Not because it was Armin's plan, not because it was foolish she'd suffered far worse, but because everyone was relying on Naruto and Eren to make it happen. If those two failed, then not only would Trost be lost, but so too would Walrose. She didn't need her shadow clone to know that. There could no doubt about that this time. And she couldn't risk revealing herself a second time just to help them. She just couldn't. So she stood there in the shadows, silent as a goddess, watching, waiting until Naruto finally finished his meeting with Pixis and came down from the wall. Even now he continued to baffle her. He didn't bother to use his maneuver gear. He simply walked right down the wall as though it were the easiest thing in the world. Fearful gasps greeted his little publicity stunt, sending Annie's temper skyrocketing. This was why humanity needed to die. They'd become rotten to the core, so filled with fear and avarice that they no longer knew how to think for themselves. Kit's Verman was merely one such human. His insane paranoia had nearly ended Eren's life before it could truly begin, and the coordinate with him. Had it not been for Naruto's intervention, she'd never have reached Pixis in time. How do you do it, Naruto? How did he throw himself headlong into impossible situations and still emerge the victor? How did he fight with such ferocity, for so little? More importantly, how had he managed to worm his way into her heart? Annie hated that. More than anything, she'd long since locked tight the door to her heart and thrown away the key. But Naruto, he'd barreled right through it. That iron door meant to keep everything locked out and away in this fragile thing that was her Sahi. And because of that, she'd nearly been exposed for what she... Why do you do it, Naruto? Why did he waste his efforts on those who weren't worthy of them? Why defend them when all but a handful spat in his face? It didn't make any sense. These fools would sooner hang him than help him, yet he simply carried on, ignoring their suspicion. Even now, he finished striding down the wall, resolutely uncaring for all the eyes glued upon him. Some made no secret of their jealousy. They longed to learn his secrets, so they too might escape the Titans as he and his students had. Others, a precious few, gazed upon him with the open awe and respect he deserved. They did not fear him, nay, they all but worshipped him, men and women of age and children who were not. This group seemed intent to make his praises known. Naruto-sama! One of them cried. We're so glad you're all right. Echoed another. Please destroy the Titans for us. Still a third cried. Naruto said nothing neither to them nor to her as he passed by. Because he didn't have to, he probably already knew what she was going to say, but that didn't mean she couldn't try. And so Annie fell into step beside her sensei, matching him stride for stride. He barely even glanced at her. They walked like that for a little while side by side, mingling amongst the troops. Observing their despondent faces and mournful wanderings, she tried to ignore them. Annie really did. But there were just so many. It was as if everyone had been drained of their very hopes and dreams. All that remained were withered, despondent husks. It's almost sad, isn't it? Naruto's voice jerked her out of her reverie. They've all succumbed to their fear. You're an idiot, she said at last, but her words lacked rancor. It's not your job to defend cowards. They kept walking, leaving the terrified soldiers and cadets in the dust, and still, Naruto didn't slow his pace. Annie began to wonder where he was taking her. even thought to ask her fellow blonde. Still, they kept walking until at long last, they reached a line of trees. Beyond them lay the territory of Wall Sina, likely to become Titan territory if Wall Rose fell today. Naruto pulled up beside a tree and uttered a nameless earth jutsu. Doton. The ground itself rose up behind him, forming an impromptu bench beside them. Her teacher promptly took a seat and leaned back to regard her, arms crossed before his chest. So I'm an idiot now, huh? His lips quirked in a slight smile. And what, pray tell, did I do this time? You could have exposed me back there. But you didn't. Annie felt a muscle jump in her jaw as she claimed a place beside him, but she refused to drop the subject. She had to know if was just screwing around or not. He must have some greater plan for her in store, else he surely would have said something to Pixis. Why? She demanded to know, leaning. Are you so sadistic that you want to keep me under your thumb? Use me as your own little slave until I've got nothing left? Or maybe, you're thinking too much, Annie. His words brought her up short. Huh! I don't want to manipulate you. Naruto stared back at her, eyes shining like a sapphire sea. I don't even want to use you, and why should I? You're my precious disciple after all. You came to save me when I needed it, not just against the Titans, but with Pixis as well. He leaned back against the bench, regarding the ever-sinking sun below the horizon. If you hadn't come when you did, I would have taken my chances, eaten Verman, and scaled the wall on my own. That's twice I owe you now. Keeping silent is merely one way of repaying that dual debt. So technically you still owe me? His gaze turned wary. I suppose so, yes. Annie held her breath for a moment, considering, daring to hoe against hope. This was her chance. If Naruto owed her, if he was the sort to repay his debts, then help me. That got a reaction. Help me kidnap Eren. I refuse. But why? She hissed, disbelieving. If I possess the coordinate, then the attacks will surely stop. And what guarantee do you have that they will? His response was flinty, his gaze dominating. I already know the armored titan and the colossal titan are posing as humans just like you. I may not know their current objective, but make no mistake, I will find them. The only question is when. It doesn't matter what I owe you. That's one request I won't grant. Then come away with me. With a great effort, Annie reined her rapidly thawing heart in. These people don't care about you. None of them do. You're wasting your talents here. Can't do that either. Naruto shook his head. I'm needed here no matter what you say. No matter how much everyone might hate me, so long as my actions make a difference in the life of one individual, and so long as that individual grows up to live a life unfilled with fear, that's all that matters. And I've already made a difference in so many lives. Nothing you say can change that. Besides, where would I go? In case you've hit your head or something, it's Titan country out there. My village would be safe, they'd accept you, after treading on the bodies of countless innocents to leave? I don't think so. You insufferable baka. Annie jerked to her feet, her face burning. What's wrong with you? Can't you see that I'm trying to help you here? Yeah, I'm an idiot all right. Naruto jumped up right after her, shoving his face against hers, shouting right back at her, an incredible idiot. An incredibly stupid idiot who took his worst enemy under his wing and taught her what it means to be human. That's what I am. Someone who spent the last 3 years of his life, who will continue to spend the rest of his life, making damn sure she doesn't fuck up hers because of some damn stupid mission given to her by some damn stupid father who doesn't know his ass from his. Slap! Naruto's voice cut off in mid-sentence, his head snapping backwards with the force of the blow. Annie glared at him, her eyes brimming with fresh tears. Don't you ever talk about my father that way. And what are you going to do about it, huh? Her teacher hissed. It doesn't change the fact that he's a heartless prick for. Annie's arm reared back to smack him again, but she underestimated his speed. Naruto had by the wrist before she knew it. Even as she thought to strike him with the other, he seized that limb, too. She was suddenly grateful for the distance between them and the wall. This would have been horrifically embarrassing, were anyone to see. Annie bucked, tangling her legs with his, yanking him forward, dragging him to the ground. Naruto choked in surprise as they went down together, he holding her wrists, and she kicking at him with all her might. Soon enough they were rolling around on the ground, each seeking the advantage over the other. I hate you! Annie railed at him. I hate you too! He shouted. I hate you. Oh yeah? Well, I hate you more. Bastard. Bitch. Insolent man. Troublesome woman. I really want to kiss you right now. Ditto. Naruto wasn't quite sure who initiated the kiss, only that someone did. Somehow, his lips pressed against hers, lips a world apart from his own, softer somehow, he couldn't bring the words to bear. Her delighted gasp snaked through his ears like smoke roiling through honey, further piquing his desire. Her tongue rolled against his with the repressed passion of an eternity. Incredibly, he found himself pulling away, only for her hands to lock around his head and draw him back in, smashing his mouth to hers in furious desire. No, the world was a hiss. No, you fucking don't. You don't get to back out now. Firm fingers twined through his hair, tickling over his scalp, tormenting him. What was it about her that drove him crazy so? He was pretty sure it had something to do with the old saying, opposites attract? If she was ice, then he was fire, determined to thaw her. There was just something about her cold demeanor that drove him to distraction, or in this case furious argumentative passion. It was exactly what he needed after losing so many students to the Titans, just a form of release. Looks like you found an outlet for all that frustration after all, Kurama mused. Naruto's smile grew another inch at the thought, his gaze shifting to the blonde beneath him. I hate you, she growled anew between kisses, so freaking much. Love you too, Annie. Naruto laughed, his mirth muffled by her mouth. His actions earned him an angry hiss. Love this. Her body smashed against his on a moan, another reminder of torment and desire, and he fought back a shudder. Too long. It had been too long since he'd experienced this, since he'd yearned to feel again. Unthinking, his hand closed around her jacket, intent on tearing it free from her body. Wait! She hissed, her teeth sinking into his lower lip. Wait! Naruto froze, his entire body rigid. I'm calling in that favor you owe me. Her eyes bored into his with unspoken need. You, me, here, now, for the next hour. Here? Was she serious? Even if one were to assume Pixis would wait that long, that was an absurdly long time. Now, Naruto was no stranger to intimacy, having already lost his to a certain Mizukage during his time, but the sheer audacity of Annie's demand actually left him a little taken aback. Now, her eyes told him she wouldn't take no for an answer. Unless you don't think I'm good enough. Another challenge, fire against ice, daring the former to yield. Naruto had no words for that. He couldn't have found them even if he tried. Instead, he nodded, then he rose. Annie barely had time to gasp before he yanked her up into his lap, forcing her body to rise with his. Then he drew back, receding further and further into the trees. He carried her as though she weighed no more than a child. A few paces later, and he lowered her just as gently, bringing her down to the floor, hands cupping at her cheeks and holding her fast, kissing, kissing, kissing. How much longer are you going to tease me, bastard? She whispered in between a kiss, shrugging at her garments. Do I have to take these off myself, hey? Rip! A hand flashed out like greased lightning, rending her shirt to rags in an instant and knocking her down. In an instant Naruto was there, forcing her down, mouth smothering an exposed breast. Nipping with sharp teeth, the moan that fled from Annie's lips was like fire in his veins. A hand dipped down, closing around the edge of her pants, but gently. Rather than ripping them away as had her jacket, his fingers proved deft, taking hold of the undergarments within, finding her nether lips to plunge deep into sensitive bundle of nerves beyond. Then followed his mouth, drawing a startled yelp from her. Better? He grinned, raising his head. Kiss me up here, you asshole, Annie hissed, her voice leaden with desire. Naruto hesitated at that, hanging over her like an ancient god, though Annie panted and mewed beneath him. She never turned from him or tried to shove him away, though glazed. Her gaze remained firmly fixed with his. On occasion she would wander to see the scars on his bare chest and forearms. Though she seemed fascinated by them, she never once asked how he'd acquired them. Nostalgia warmed his eyes, reminding him of the very first woman who had seen these scars, gazed upon them with wonderment, and said nothing. Annie did not ask him now either, nor did she press him. A lone tear trickled down his right eye to land upon her cheek. Why were you crying? She asked, staring at him in disbelief. Naruto had never cried since she'd met him. Never. It's nothing, Naruto laughed bitterly, just an old memory. The ice in her eyes softened for a moment, her lips moving almost inaudibly. What? I said, let's make a new one then, she replied softly, arching up beneath him to push her lips to his. Naruto froze. Not once had he ever considered being intimate with anyone ever again. Not like this. He'd always thought himself too jaded after he'd lost Mei in the war. Until this very moment he thought Annie must have been messing with him, pulling his leg, being her usual cold, callous, demanding self. Now he realized she actually wanted him, truly shared his sentiment, because he felt the grip on his wrist slacken, slide, until her fingers were intertwining with his. The realization brought him more joy than he'd ever thought he could feel. All right. He bent to kiss her again, and was reminded once more of the strange bond they shared, not that of a master and student, but of something else, one of pain. Each knew what it was like to face adversity and emerge victorious out of that fire, forged into something strong and unbreakable. They each had cracks in their armor, weaknesses that the other loved to exploit. There was none of that now, none of that at all, as her tongue tangled with his, inflaming his desire to an almost feverish degree. Thoughts of Mikasa and Sasha and Mina flickered through his mind. Lord Almighty, this wouldn't be fun to explain to any of them, but his passion pushed such thoughts down, leaving him only eyes for the young woman beneath him. A thought flickered in the back of his mind, surfacing as the young woman beneath him wriggled her way out of her pants, exposing cream-smooth skin and long legs that seemed to go on for miles. Only, oh bugger, I love you! Annie gasped out, suddenly startling both of them. Naruto stared at her for a long moment, mouth agape, utterly disbelieving in what he had just heard. Never once had he thought to hear such words again, certainly not from her mouth. Kurama shared in his disbelief. What did you just say? To his infinite disbelief and delight, the blonde beneath him burned brighter than a volcano. I'm not going to say it again, idiot, she sputtered, struggling to reclaim some of her pride. In that instant, Naruto was all but unable to take his eyes off of her. Annie, he drew a deep breath, swallowed, exhaled. He'd said these words before to her in mockery. Now he had to wonder, did he actually mean them? He knew the answer already. He felt the same, just as he felt for all his students, just as he felt for Mina, Mikasa, Sasha. Yes, of course, he realized with an epiphany. I love you too. He lowered his lips to hers again before she could speak, and for the next hour, their world consisted only of the two of them. In those sinful 60 minutes, everything just fell away. The hour passed by far too swiftly. I can't believe we did that. Disbelief didn't even come close to explaining how Naruto felt in this moment. Yes, there was shock, but there was also joy, a fierce radiance bubbling up inside him, threatening to explode outwards in a joyous shout at the slightest provocation. He lay there with her, his body no longer slicked with the sweat of their exertions, but warm and dry. Regrets? She whispered, his lips nibbling at his ear. None, he sighed happily. Annie rose her head up from his chest and kissed him before she got up from their impromptu bed of grass and leaves to find her clothes. She even walks around differently than other women, Naruto thought to himself, recalling the last time he'd been with May. She had slid out from the covers with only a smoldering smile and left him behind to change, uncaring if his attention traced across every inch of her body. Annie simply strode around the clearing, bending over to retrieve articles of clothing as she discovered them, slowly gathering up her uniform. She has nothing to be shy about, anyway, he thought as she had bent over to pick up the white underwear he tugged off with his teeth only an hour earlier that evening. She shot a look at him as he watched her, her cheeks dusted with pink, as she put her clothes on, underwear first. There was just something so godman cute about that. That was certainly an interesting hour, Naruto murmured to himself as he pulled up his pants and readjusted his belt, holstering on his gear once more. Hidden away in the shadows afforded both by the trees and the sun, he felt almost at ease. Despite his nakedness, all of his earlier anger and frustration were gone. Having vanished with the light on the horizon, it was as if he'd had a knot trapped inside his stomach for these last 3 years, a terrible tautness that had refused to leave him alone. Until now. Me neither. Kurama's satisfaction was tantamount to joyous weeping. It's been so long since you've been with a woman, and you betted the best FO the bunch. You done this old fox proud. Shut up, will ya? The last sage risked one last glance over his shoulder, and was well rewarded with a glimpse of alabaster skin just before Annie Leonhardt reclaimed her scattered articles of clothing, slipped her shirt back on. It suddenly struck him that she hadn't been wearing a bra the entire time. Well now, that'd be an interesting little fact to remember. Hentai, she scolded as she caught him staring, pausing to cross both arms before her bare bosom. Stop staring at me like that. Hey, Naruto replied, I was just making sure I didn't bruise you anywhere. They'd certainly been rough enough to push their regeneration to its limits, biting and scratching and clawing with everything they had, and more, It must have brought a smile to his face, because her scowl deepened. Hentai. It's not like you weren't looking either, he continued. In fact, your eyes were wandering quite a bit when we HNTI. The forcefulness of her statement prompted him to perform an about-face. He'd no desire to anger her after their wonderful lovemaking. Then, as Annie Leonhardt often did, she surprised him. A slow sigh snaked between his teeth as he felt all the softness of her female form press itself against his still bare back. Her arms following suit seconds later. Annie. Who would have thought that despite their differences, this would actually happen? Not him, not at all. Never, even in a million years. The slightest of smiles pulled at his whiskered cheeks at such a thought. You know, I could get used to this. You have a lot of scars, she murmured into his back. Naruto sighed, blue eyes drifting shut in the evening light. He'd known this was coming, seen it a mile away. Annie simply wasn't the type to keep her mouth shut. If she wanted to say something, then damn it she'd say it. Didn't matter if it hurt your feelings or not. Even now could feel her running her fingertips up and down his back, her crystal-colored eyes tracing every line that were meant to be seen, and some that weren't. Annie was silent for a long time. He could feel her scrutiny boring into his very soul. She was curious, dying to ask him where he'd gotten so many wounds. So? He asked at last, are you curious? Yes. Naruto sked softly to himself and turned in her arms, presenting his body unto hers, nuzzling his head into her neck. There was slightest hitch in her breath as he did so. It was the sweetest sound he'd ever heard. The swell of her bare breasts pushing up against his chest, skin to skin, was enough to send shivers shooting down his spine. Once more, he was stricken by just how small she seemed here, held in his arms. He was heads and shoulders taller than her and certainly much stronger, and yet for all that she lacked in size, he knew Annie could give anyone a brutal beating if she were so inclined. She was feisty, cold at times, and yet at other, as he'd so recently learned, she could be downright warm. It was just one of the many things he was beginning to love about her. Love, that was a new one, wasn't it? He'd sealed off his heart since May's death all those years ago, only to have it wrenched open once again by these blasted kids. He was still adjusting to such a concept. He loved all his students in equal measure. Mikasa, Armin, Jean, Mina, Sasha, Krista, Annie herself, and last but not least, though unbeknownst to the others, Marco. He cared for all of them, Naruto told himself, and yet he knew he'd be lying to himself if his female students didn't have a slight edge over the others, just as Annie had momentarily carved for herself the lead spot in his heart. For now, he still wasn't sure how he'd explain to the others what had happened here today. The longer they stayed her, the greater the chance they risked of creating complications. His thoughts soon proved prophetic as Annie touched a hand to his neck, caressing the very spots where Haku's needles had torn into him when he was just a boy. It had been his first true shinobi combat outside the village. Those demon brothers didn't count and he'd nearly died. Now that had been a close one. Naruto spent the next 15 minutes allowing her to examine him, spending undue time he shouldn't have. It was an enlightening experience to say the least. All the while the sun continued to sink lower and lower toward the horizon. And this? At last she traced a faint indentation just below his right pectoral. Well, that's what happens when your best friend shoves a Chidori through your lung and out of your back, Naruto found himself replying. It hurt like a bitch at the time, wa? Just then he noticed her disbelief. Clearly she was wondering how anyone, not just him, could survive such a debilitating wound. Don't make that face. You know how I heal. Yes, but, that's the same technique you taught Mikasa. Yeah, he felt wistful just talking about it. I know she won't misuse it, though. She might have Uchiha blood, but she's a good kid. They stared at each a long moment before he finally released her, bending down to retrieve his battered jacket. So am I still a pervert? He purred at her. I hate you, she murmured. I am fully aware of that, Annie, he said, glancing down at himself. To what do I owe the pleasure of your unexpected attention? A smirk stretched across his face, leaving her weak and wanting. She had no idea how much longer she could hold herself from sexually assaulting him again. He kissed her fingers tips one at a time, each brush and passing of his lips leaving her face flushing. She reached up and grabbed at his half-slung jacket, seeking to pull him closer. Re-yip. Both blondes blinked as Naruto's jacket, beaten and battered from their lovemaking, split down the center. Annie started giggling at him. The expression on his face as the shirt ripped had been wonderful. He had looked down in mild surprise, but when he returned his gaze to her, it was a very sheepish look that he wore. I told you that shirt was ruined, she said as she leaned forward and kissed him. Hoping that this slight derailment wouldn't affect his desire for her, he laughed and hungrily kissed her back. Leaning into her, forcing her to lie back down on the tree, another 15 minutes died that way. When she was fully dressed, she came over to him and kissed him for a final time. They stood like that for a long instant, cherishing the moment. Bak rang. Naruto reluctantly tore his lips from hers as a black flare roared into the sky. Pixis was waiting for him. Whatever plan he had for restoring troop morale was about to begin. She looked slightly saddened as they neared the wall once more. Well then, I guess this is it, isn't it? You're going to go play hero now, aren't you? I'm the only one who can make sure Eren doesn't go berserk. If you make it back in one piece, she said, her subtle look of sorrow vanishing as she smiled deviously at him, then perhaps we'll do this again. He started in surprise as she stood up on her tiptoes, her lips pushing against his mouth with a ferocity he hadn't expected. She didn't even give him time to return the kiss. She simply turned and left without another word. Naruto listened to her retreat, observing her departure silently. As her footsteps took his fellow blonde further and further away from him, he sighed and closed his eyes, placing his hands behind his head. The entire hour flashed through his mind again, and he couldn't help but smile as her last words echoed in his mind. Perhaps we'll do this again. Well, he thought, smiling, at least there's that. Pixis was waiting for him as he climbed the wall. So too were his students. None dared wonder where he had been for so long. It wasn't as though the Titans below were going anywhere. The only risk that lay in waiting was that more and more of them would doubtlessly come through the gap as time went on. Granted, that risk could be countered by shadow clones, but his students didn't have anywhere as much pull in the technique as he did. He really couldn't expect a counter-offensive from them in that regard. You certainly took your time, the wizened commander noted. Had some business to wrap up, Naruto drawled. Annie scaled the wall seconds later and for the most part, paid him no attention. Her intentions were betrayed in the slightest glance at him. Her eyes softening as they held his, Naruto stubbornly fought the urge to smile back. They'd agreed to arrive separately. It would arouse suspicions if they were seen together. Besides, the last thing they, or anyone needed right now was dissent in the ranks, and a relationship between student and teacher would do just that. Are you prepared to throw your life away? Hardly, the blonde rolled his shoulders. But if that's what it takes to seal the hole, who am I to judge? Well said. Pixis took a deep breath and exhaled it in the same instant, facing towards the troops gathered below. Then, attention! All at once the susurrus of fearful whispers below fell silent. Even Naruto was amazed at the man's ability to project his voice. I will now elaborate on the plan to recapture Trost District. The objective of this plan is to seal the hole in the destroyed gate. I will now explain how we intend to seal that hole. Belonging to the Survey Corps, this is Uzumaki Naruto and his student, of the Training Corps, Eren Jiga. They are the product of successful top-secret Titan transformation research. They are each capable of generating a Titan's body and moving it according to their will. In their Titan form, one of them will lift the large boulder in the vicinity of the front gate, carry it to the destroyed gate, and seal it. Your duty is to protect them from other Titans until they've moved that boulder. Carry that large boulder? That's just has mankind finally taken control of the Titans? You're lying! Des screamed. I won't risk my life for a retarded reason like that. What do you think we are? We're not disposable blades, you know. Up on the wall, Naruto twitched. That little shit, is he still bitching around? I should have killed him when I had the chance. Beside him, Sasha stiffened. Oh crap, Sensei's getting pissed. Still the cries continued to rise, growing steadily louder with each moment, each passing second. Human weapons, he says. That's obviously a lie. Making fools of us. They're telling us to die here today. I'm out of here. Me too. Same here. I've had enough of this. Though the soldiers continued to panic, Pixis stood strong in the face of this adversity. Heed my command, he declared. Those who desert us now will all be pardoned. Once a man surrenders to their fear of Titans, they are no longer fit for battle. Those who've experienced that terrible fear are free to leave. Furthermore, those of you who want your parents, siblings, and loved ones to experience that same fear for themselves may also leave. There was a silence. Slowly but surely, the murmurings of dissent morphed into ones of resolve, and Naruto realized the commander's brilliance. Few, if any, of the soldiers were willing to condemn those they deemed precious to death at the hands of the Titans. Let us think back to 4 years ago, the commander continued. Recall the plan to recapture Wall Maria, though I presume you all know this without me having to say, the plan itself sounded glorious. But in essence, it was a way to rid ourselves of the unemployed that the government was unable to support. The only reason everyone maintained their silence was because we managed to survive with these confined walls, thanks to their sacrifices. All of mankind bears that sin, including myself. Well, that explains a lot. Naruto experienced a bitter epiphany just then. I was wondering what happened to all those I rescued and they were sent off the slaughter instead. Such is the way of humanity, Kurama shared in his disgust. In our time, no one would have dared do such a thing. If Pixis recognized the killer in it, he said little otherwise. Because the inhabitants of Wall Maria were few in number, the conflict did not escalate. But what about now? If Wall Rose is breached, reducing the mouths to feed by a fifth won't suffice. Not even a half of the remaining population can be supported within only Wall Sina. Should mankind cease to exist, it would not be because we were all devoured by Titans. We humans would be our own end. We mustn't die within narrower walls. He spread his arms wide, his voice peaking at the last. I implore you, my fellow soldiers, die where you stand today, so that your loved ones may not die tomorrow. Only a few minutes later, Mikasa found Naruto giving them a similar speech. He'd gathered them here atop the wall sometime afterwards. The plan was made, their decision set. They, as Naruto's students, would serve as the vanguard, excepting Armin, who would remain behind due to his tactical prowess. Besides, his frail body wasn't exactly suited to battle. But that wasn't the problem here. Fear, confusion, dread, she could see it in the eyes of Jean and the others. They were baffled in more ways than one. Not only that Naruto had secretly taught and trained Marco, gifting him techniques he daren't teach them, but that he'd kept this monstrous ability under wraps all this time. Remarkably, Sasha seemed the least bit fazed by it all. If anything, she seemed relieved, but that didn't make any sense. Only she and Armin had witnessed Naruto's ungodly Titan form, exempting Eren of course, so why then did the potato girl seem so at ease? Mikasa silently made a note to inquire further. Listen well. Naruto cleared his throat, gaining his students' attention, silencing their murmurs. I know you weren't expecting this. None of you were. You may be surprised by what you have been told here today. You might be shocked by what you have learned. And it's all true, every last bit of it. His blue eyes took them each in turn, warm and emphatic. That's right. I possess the same power as Eren. The power to transform into a Titan at will. For the last 3 years I have held this power and kept it a secret from each of you. Mikasa and Armin have seen it for themselves and they aren't afraid. But there is another secret I have yet to tell you lot, and here he did roll his shoulders. I suppose now's as good a time as any, Kurama, if you will? As if on cue, sapphire irises snapped into scarlet. When next he spoke his voice was not his own, but that of another. It was if a coin had been flipped. If Naruto was heads, then this other him was certainly tails. She'd not been able to put her finger on it before, but she was almost certain she recognized this other half, this darker persona. It was almost as if she knew him. 3 years to this day, the stranger in Naruto's body began. You witnessed this brat transform into a giant fox. I trust you haven't forgotten? That form was me, the great Kurama. I reside within your precious sensei, and my chakra dwells within 2 of you. His lips pulled back to expose sharp, deadly teeth. It's so nice to finally lay eyes on the rest of you with my own eyes. Do try not to panic and die today, little meatbags. It'd be such a shame if your potential went to waste. Kurama blinked, and just like that, Naruto was back in control. Blue eyes regarded them coolly, waiting for panic to break out. When none did, he sighed. Many things have changed. His voice was a touch softer than she'd ever heard. As I told you yesterday, you are no longer my students, and I am no longer your teacher. But with these revelations, your viewpoint of me has doubtlessly changed even further. Some of you may even think me a monster. But one thing hasn't changed. To me, you are still my precious students, and as such, I still care for each of you. I would gladly lay down my life here at your feet if it meant I could keep you all alive. But I cannot do that. My strength is needed here today. Your strength is needed here today. But if any of you think me a monster, if any of you have succumbed to fear, feel free to walk away at this very moment. I will not stop you. Bullshit, Mina Carolina croaked out, startling her fellow blackette. Her sensei gave her the look, but otherwise didn't comment on this less than delicate response. Apparently that was close enough to how he thought she'd feel when he revealed his less than savory history. Sensei, she continued, stepping to him, why should we be afraid of you? I'm not saying you shout, Naruto replied stoically, staring down at the shorter girl. Only that I won't blame you for your fear, MMPH. His words died then and there as her mouth found his, seeking not his cheek this time, but his lips, her tongue caging his for what felt like an eternity. Mikasa bristled at the sight, her mouth forming a small, open O at the sight. That little wench, how dare she do such a thing? She wouldn't stand for it. Almost before she thought to stop herself, she stepped to her sensei and elbowed Mina aside, taking one of his arms for her own. To her dismay, Mina did the exact same thing. You're not allowed to kiss him, she said softly, refusing to falter under the girl's withered glare. And why is that? Mina clutched Naruto tighter. Be because you don't care about him like I do. What? Mina refused to give ground. She held tighter to the baffled blonde and stuck out her tongue. Her resolve didn't waver in the slightest. Ridiculous. Both girls glared at one another. Sparks flew betwixt and between them. Out of the corner of her eye Mikasa watched Aram's sweat drop at the odd behavior. Jean's reaction was slightly more outstanding. The boy practically facepalmed, doubtless. Her fellow disciple was less than pleased by this strange, unusual brok of etiquette, or perhaps he was just jealous? Only Kami knew, just as Mikasa knew she wasn't about to yield to her rival for Naruto's affections. Their standoff lasted all of an instant longer. Then, to their dual disbelief, Naruto shook himself free. I appreciate your feelings, he began slowly. But now isn't the time for this, we'll discuss it later. Assuming we live through today, Mikasa didn't like that at all. By effectively telling them not to display their feeling in public, he was basically telling them to shut the hell up and get along with one another, as if Mikasa could after what she'd just seen. But sensei, and Naruto's right, someone seconded, severing that thought. Now isn't the time for this. Mikasa's eyebrows shot up. Krista? Well now, this was a surprise, Naruto mused to himself, though everyone seemed surprised and in Annie's case, more than slightly miffed by Mikasa and Mina's display of affection. No one actually spoke out against his command. None admitted that they were afraid to give up their lives today, terrified that they all might die a horrible death before today was through. Each stood fast and strong, refusing to even consider the possibility of their own impending demise. Well, aren't you a lucky bastard, Kurama butted in. You've got most of your female students pining after you and one in the sack already. It's almost a shame that Krista lass has a thing for Aimer, you know. Okay, we are not talking about this. Drawing himself up to his full height, the blonde crossed both arms behind his back. Whatever had stirred in his heart, it was gone now. Ever since the Titans appeared, mankind has not once claimed victory over them. For every inch the Titans advanced, you have retreated in kind, continually giving up territory. However, when this plan succeeds, mankind will recapture territory from the Titans for the first time in history. That moment will mark the first time mankind has triumphed over the Titans. Compared to all that mankind has lost thus far, this may be overwhelmingly insignificant. However, despite that, to mankind, it will be a great advance. I have faith in each of you. Go out there and kick some Titan ass, is what you said, Kurama growled as they traversed the city. But do you have any guarantee that brat won't snap and attack us instead? Naruto was silent for a long moment at that one. The only sound to be heard was that of his maneuver gear carrying them to the boulder. There was only the wind in his hair and the knowledge that no matter happened here today, people were going to die. He'd already abandoned the notion of saving everyone. He simply wanted to get the breach plugged as swiftly as possible before something happened. Sasha and Mikasa would be accompany him this far alongside the elite squad. But as even the best generals knew, sometimes the most well-laid plans went awry. In short, he really didn't have an answer for the Fox's inquiry. Nope. So basically, we're winging it, again. The Kitsun's deadpan was barely concealed. Pretty much. A flash of green light to his right signaled the start of Aaron's transformation, cutting off whatever his tenant might have said. And that's our cue. As one, the blonde disengaged his maneuver gear and raised a thumb to his mouth. Blood spurted against his tongue as he sank his teeth into the lone digit. His figure engulfed in a lightning bolt of pure power. There was a terrifying sensation of weightlessness. Then gravity took hold, sending his body crashing down into a nearby building. He lay there for a moment, making absolutely certain he had control. Then, and only then, did he begin to move, his titan form levering itself out of the debris in silence, its breath causing the very earth to tremble. Blazing crimson orbs surveyed all before him, his 6 arms working as one to lever his body out of the evacuated building into which he had fallen. He stood tall and proud, surveying the humans lining the rooftop, searching for any signs that anything was amiss. Finding nothing, he allowed his body to relax, if only minutely. Is he in control? Rico wondered aloud. As though he'd read her mind, the gigantic blonde flashed a single thumbs up with one of his many hands. He turned to face the boulder, waiting for Eren to take the lead. Alright then, now let's get this over with, huh? Naruto frowned at Eren's titan form. It was behaving strangely. Instead of lifting the boulder as had been the plan, it was just standing there, gazing off into empty space, uncaring even as countless soldiers began to perish around them. Sasha and the others, his precious shinobi students, were out there buying time for Eren to lift the boulder while the task of personally protecting him fell to Naruto's titan form, and all because he himself didn't want any part of the glory. He was beginning to regret that decision, tch. At this rate he'd have to do it himself. Striding forward, he reached out with one of his 6 arms, seeking to jostle the smaller titan by the shoulder. Jigger, he growled, get your head out of your ass. We need to move. No response. Naruto shook him again, roughly this time. Eren! That got a response. The titan turned to face him, green eyes narrow. A low growl left his lips, causing the blonde to stiffen. What in the world? Dodge. Perhaps it was his confusion. Or maybe the misguided belief that Eren wouldn't dare attack him for fear of what he'd seen earlier. Regardless, Naruto found himself unprepared as the rogue titan lurched to its feet, eyes little more than slits in the back of its head, hands clenched into fists. Oh! Clenched knuckles barreled into his unprotected face. Hard. It all happened so fast, Sasha realized. One moment Naruto and Eren were standing there. The next, Eren attacked her senpai, even as part of her itch to defend him. Her training kicked in, cold reasoning dousing the flames of her anger. Now was not the time for a burning heart. Cooler heads needed to prevail. Titans were closing in. Naruto and Eren couldn't afford to fight now, but she could. Her affinity was Earth. She could easily use the land itself to keep them tied down for a few precious minutes in order to finish them off. But that would require speed she alone possessed. The only risk that presented was getting awfully close. No. She had to do this. Even if it meant her life would be rendered forfeit. Her heart sank into her stomach at the thought. Steeling herself, she dug deep into the reservoir that was her chakra, then deeper still, reaching for the 8 gates that her mentor had taught her. 3 of them opened almost immediately, her hair standing on end, her skin staining itself the color of blood. She could feel everyone's eyes on her, unable to believe what they were witnessing. Here goes nothing. Naruto grunted in surprise, staggering back a step, jaw hanging loose from the blow. Out of the corner of his eye he saw Sasha hurtling toward the encroaching titans. Somehow, the sight of his student hurling herself in the face of the enemy galvanized him. Any regrets he might have had at harming Eren vanished in that instant. Fine then. If that brat wanted to lose himself in that titan body of his. So you wanna play, huh? Eren's response was to roar and lunge, slavering maw split wide for the kill. His senpai didn't even bother to backpedal or block. Instead he struck upward with all six arms, driving massive fists into the smaller titan's torso with all the force of an explosive typhoon. They struck the earth together as one, grappling and growling and grabbing at one another, each seeking the upper hand when none seemed to be found. But while Eren's smaller body afforded him a smaller target, Naruto was a good 5 meters larger, stronger, and with arms to spare. Within seconds he'd levered himself upward, utilizing his massive build to prevent his berserk student from dealing a potentially crippling blow. The titan tried to strike him in the face and received headbutt, staggering its body for a precious pair of seconds. Naruto didn't know whether Eren was remotely sane enough to realize his mistake, but he was about to pay for it dearly. 2 arms locked around the smaller titan's shoulders, in a vicious vice, and pulled, preventing him from utilizing his superhuman strength ever again. Forgive me, Eren. This was Naruto's last thought before he ripped the titan's arms off with his almighty strength, severing them at the shoulders. Eren screamed, roaring in pain as steam spouted from the stumps that had once been his arms, screamed as Naruto thrust him down to the ground. Fists met face all at once, all 6 of his arms working as one single entity, striking and striking and striking, pounding down with relentless force. You stupid buffoon! He ground out between each blow. I don't have time for this. Come to your senses. Back to yourself. Didn't you want to go outside? To see the world, beyond these walls and the ocean? Snap the fuck out of it. His fist struck down for a final time, smashing the Titan flash in the face. Still no response. Had Eren lost himself to the Titan for good? In any case, he didn't have time to sit and wait around for him to awake. Growling, Naruto strode to the boulder, his 6 arms flexing in anticipation as he approached the gigantic rock. He only hoped Mikasa would forgive him for abandoning her foster brother. Naruto's approaching the boulder. Dimly, as though from a great distance, he could hear Ian barking out orders, defend him at all costs. Grunting, the blonde took himself to task and wrapped all 6 of his arms into the gigantic rock. With a supreme efforts, he began to pull, heavy. That was his first thought when his arms closed around it. Even with his titanic strength, it took him more than several seconds to muster the power needed just to lift it off the ground, let alone over his head and into the air. But in time he succeeded, hoisting it high with some strain. There was just one problem. Ian and the others were doing their job, but there were far more Titans than there should be, more than they, or their limited numbers could hope to handle alone. To the east, he could see Sasha struggling to hold off another wave of Titans. Her chakra usage was spiking faster than her kill count, it seemed. Was it because of Kurama's chakra? He wondered. Now that he had to tend to the task of moving the boulder himself, now that he'd finally gotten the damn thing off the ground and onto his back, how the hell was he supposed to get it to the gate, in one piece? With his greater size and strength, he'd originally been meant to protect Eren, utilizing his control to keep the Titans off him. Now, forced to attend the task alone, he realized sacrificing himself might very well become an all-too-real option. Even now he could see the Titans lumbering towards him, alerted by his massive form just standing there, holding the boulder. This couldn't possibly end well. If he had to stop and defend himself in each instance, they'd never get this hole closed. Behind him, something stirred in his peripherals. Naruto could only pray that it was Eren. Have you come to your senses yet? A low, warbling growl greeted him as something grabbed him from behind. Nope. Definitely not Eren. Saniva. Teeth clamped down on the aberrant's neck, crushing vertebrae in an instant. The rogue Titan swung the body down with gusto, tearing it to pieces with the sheer momentum of its throw. Seemingly satisfied with this kill, it dropped the now smoldering corpse to the ground. Eren stared at him for a long moment, then he lurched to his feet. His arms returned in an instant, flesh and muscle sprouting over bone. He took one look at them, glanced at Naruto, then back to the Titans. Something seemed to resolve itself in those green eyes. He watched the boy become Titan raise a hand and thump it once against his chest. As if that weren't enough, he opened his mouth and gave a might-sounding Ruahuya-warg. Naruto grunted. I'll take that as a yes. With fire in his face and Eren at his back, he strode forward into the jaws of death. He could only pray for the safety of his students now. Their fate was no longer in his hands but their own. Sonova bitch! Jean Kirchstein was cursing that very fate as he barreled down the streets of Trost, trying and failing to outrun the swarm of Titans he'd attracted. They were gaining on him, slow but steady. Damn maneuver gear! Of all the times to malfunction, it had broken at the worst possible time. Now what would he do? He was barely outrunning them as things stood, but if this kept up... In the end, inspiration came from the most unlikely of sources. A torch flickered in his peripherals as he ran. Against all odds, someone had forgotten to put it out before they fled. Jean had never considered the practical applications for fire before joining the military. Upon becoming a shinobi, he thought even less of such things. For the last 3 years he trained relentlessly from dawn to dusk, and it was only in the last month of his training that Naruto ever mentioned affinities. Sasha had taken to earth, Annie air, Mikasa lingered in lightning, Mina was like a fish in well, water, and Krista, their sweet, gentle little Krista, had 2 affinities, water and earth. Armin had none, though he appeared to be well-rounded in each category. Marco's main proficiency, when the hell did Naruto have time to train him, was that of Sannin techniques, making up for his lack of jutsu. But what did Jean have? Fire. According to Naruto, he had a natural talent bordering on that of an Uchihos. He'd had the smallest amount of chakra from the beginning, but Naruto had worked with him, helped him to raise that meager reserve of all but lackluster into something magnificent. He taught him one of the most powerful jutsu he'd even witnessed, a great fire cataclysm that could wipe out an entire army, an entire city if used incorrectly. Just one usage depleted a fourth of his own reserves. For Jean to use such a technique, it all but exhausted nearly all his chakra. But what choice did he have? His maneuver gear wasn't working properly, and if those titans got a hold of him, it was game over. Steeling himself, he drew in a deep breath, kneading the chakra in his stomach, giving it shape and form. Goka Mekakyu. He exhaled mightily, expelling all the chakra he'd been stoking in his lungs. The great fireball that burst forth from his lips was no fireball at all. It was a rising, focused inferno that swept forward in a straight line, roiling forward, into the titans. The great Goliaths had just enough time to realize their folly before the blaze overtook their position, swallowing them whole. But it didn't stop there. Jean balked, baffled as the hot blaze kept going, sweeping onward in a fierce arc, incinerating a score of nearby buildings, charring them to ash alongside the titans he'd attacked. Oh shit! His mind railed against this sudden turnabout, instinctively fought the realization that he might have killed someone just now, reminding itself that everyone had already been evacuated. Jean seriously hoped that was the case. He didn't think he'd be able to bear such a catastrophic loss of life. Still, it was then, as the titans collapsed in a smoldering heap, that Jean realized something. Fire was a handy tool to have. Swiria! Water Dragon! Mina Carolina shouted with all her might and drew upon her chakra, willing the moisture to resonate in the air around her body, taking the shape she so desired, that of a dragon. Its great bulk towered over her and all she'd come to protect, leering down at the titans lining the street. When it had at last grown large enough, she willed the beast forward, its body flooding the streets, its teeth making short work of necks and heads alike in swift succession below. Armin! She called, do it! Now! Right! Her fellow student rushed past, a wedge of kunai in each hand. He leapt and let them fly, each knife armed with an explosive tag. They sank straight and true, landing just below the neck of each titan. The blonde landed beside her, and raised his hand into a sign. Katsu! An explosion rocked the streets below, effectively finishing off the wretched lives of the titans. It's a shame Krista couldn't join us, he mused to himself. Would have made things easier. Mizurapa! His head snapped around just in time to witness the blackhead forcefully expel a gout of water from her lips, blasting a climbing aberrant off its perch to join the others in the flood down below. Mina wiped a bead of sweat from her brow. No, it's nothing. She stood in the worst disadvantage here. With no water to draw upon and manipulate, she was forced to create it entirely with her own reserves. It was exhausting work, but for every life she saved she felt as though she'd done a world of good. For each survivor meant another loved one would return safely to their families. Loved one. Her cheeks flushed at the thought, an image of Naruto emerging in her mind. I can't believe I kissed him back there. Just the thought of it made her squirm. She'd actually cursed at him, and then kissed him. There was no way someone as powerful, wonderful, and so incredibly kind as Naruto could ever possibly return her feelings. But still, it was well worth it. If she could bring herself to do such a thing in public, then there might be a chance for her yet. Mina. The blackhead blinked, drawn from her swooning by Armin's voice. Armin pointed to the still-soaked streets. I think you overdid it a little. Oops, she sweat dropped at the small flooded she'd created. I really hope that evaporates before Sensei sees. Disappear. Annie flicked her fingers and an invisible wind erupted from her palms, slamming into each titan nearest her, eviscerating their necks to bloody shreds. 3 more titans perished before her unseen assaults, their lives snatched before they'd even knew what had killed them. Beside her 2 more toppled as Marco blurred past them, ending their lives crushing cuts to the neck. So that was the power of his senjutsu then. She'd known that Sage Mode gave an individual unbelievable strength, skill, and speed, but this was ridiculous. Being the elite of Naruto's pupils, the pair had an entire sector to themselves. Annie was almost grateful for that. It meant she didn't have to deal with the precocious elites, and seeing as she barely knew Marco, she did not have a reason to be particularly aggressive towards him until now. Ano Annie-san? Yeah? Aren't you overdoing things a little? Huh! The blonde glared bloody red daggers at Marco, daring him to say something else. She didn't care if he was Naruto's successor or prodigy, or anything. For some reason her blood still continued to boil. Perhaps it had to do with what she'd seen back on the wall. Perhaps it was that the sight of Mina and Mikasa each clinging to her sensei. Whatever it was, it inflamed her fury to an almost righteous degree. It was only then that she saw his eyes, that she realized Marco was still using Sage mode. Strange. Why was Marco still using? It's strange, he murmured, peering intently at her. I can sense titans when I'm like this, and for a second there, you know, he shook his head, suddenly sheepish. I'm still new at this. I must have made a mistake, or something. What? Annie pressed, feeling a snake of dread slither into her gut. A snake of losing everything she'd ever known, everything she just gained. What were you talking about? For a second there, you had the same aura as a titan. Annie froze. Oh no, he was going to screw everything up. Just when she'd finally thought herself to have found a bit of solace, it had to be taken away. In that instant his mind shut down, presenting her with two possibilities, kill or be killed, if there was any chance that Marco was suspicious. If he acted on those suspicions and told someone, everything would be ruined. She was suddenly conscious of the blade in her hand. Its weight, the weight of what she now had to do, seemed impossibly heavy. She couldn't risk it, couldn't trust him as she trusted Naruto. He wasn't reliable, trustworthy, or anything like his mentor. She panicked. He'd tell everyone. Then she'd have no choice but to run or be killed, both by her own people and those within the walls. She would never be safe again, all because of him, because of she'd made a stupid decision and slipped up. But there was a way out of this, she realized, if Marco never told anyone. Marco, hi, what's that over there? She pointed in a random direction, silently hoping he'd fall for her trick. He did. I don't see anything. Biting back tears, Annie waited until she was certain his back was completely turned. Then she raised her sword high, and cut down at his body. The entire world was a blur to Mikasa Ackerman. At the outset of Naruto and Aaron's conflict, she'd wanted nothing more to step in. But she just couldn't bring herself to choose between the boy that had saved her as a child, and the man who had taught her everything she knew, just and all, and so she'd flung herself away, tears in her eyes, emotions tearing at her heart as she continued to fend off the titans until Naruto finally got Eren under control. That had been 5 minutes ago, maybe longer. Mikasa no longer knew. What she did know was thus. For some reason, she was in perfect form on a sudden. Indeed, the world was a blur. Every titan she encountered seemed to be moving in slow motion, their movements stiff and sluggish in comparison to her own. Sometimes, she even managed to predict what they would do before they did it. Her kill count continued to skyrocket, before she finally found the cause of her sudden increase in ability. Until this moment she'd assumed it to be her anger at Mina, aggression driving her to try harder and harder to prove herself in the eyes of her sensei. Now she knew otherwise. She caught sight of herself in a nearby window then, and her heart nearly stopped. Why were her eyes red? Wait, that wasn't right, they were indeed red. But she could see a tomo within each of them, a single black comma mark standing out against her scarlet irises. A prickle of very real fear touched at her heart. What's happening to me? So you've finally activated your Sharingan, Kurama's voice rebounded through her head. Interesting. What? You needn't shout, the fox yawned. Some of my chakra dwells within you and brows. It's only natural I'd want to keep tabs on my investments. Speaking of which, you may want to take a look over yonder. Mikasa's gaze snapped back toward the breach. Sure enough, she could see something moving in its direction. Titans, 2 of them. But that could only mean Naruto. She couldn't help it. Her eyes began to mist over as she saw him carrying the boulder. A veritable atlas bearing all the weight of the world on his shoulders. But that didn't make any sense. Eren was supposed to have been the one to carry the boulder, not the blonde. Had something happened? Even so, they were nearly to the gate. Eren just had to protect him for a few more seconds. Oi Gaki! Mikasa started as the sound of someone's maneuver gear dragged her from her reverie. A figure alighted effortlessly upon the rooftop beside her, his coat bearing the wings of freedom upon his back. He stared back at her for a long moment, dark eyes narrowing at the sight of her still crimson orbs. Belatedly, Mikasa realized that the scouting legion had finally arrived. What's the situation here? Levi demanded to know. Numbed, Mikasa could only point down toward the breach in the same instant that Naruto's titan body broke into a run. It was as though he'd finally realized that the goal stood within sight. Only a few precious yards of open, tight and free space separated him from the gate now that the titans had been drawn to Eren. Despite herself, the Blackette felt just a touch afraid as she uttered a single, solitary word. There was something about it, that glint in her eyes, which left her undoubtedly at ease. That, Levi followed her arm, eyes widening slightly as he recognized the six-armed Titan bolting for the breach, boulder raised firmly in his many hands. Oh, isn't that Ora! With a mighty roar and an equally lengthy heave, Naruto slammed the massive rock down against the gate with a resounding thud. Cracks burst against the wall, rising from the sudden impact as the boulder barred the hole, forever barring the Titans that sought to climb inside. Naruto stood there for a long moment, hunched down in his final exertion. Then he stood. A low, throaty growl fled from his jaws. All the Titans in the area held his gaze, unknowing of the terror that had been free to feed upon them. They were far too focused on Eren Jaeger. That then was their first mistake, also their last. Now then, time for the second course.